Well, I think we're 2 minutes. Can we officially just introduce people? Is that okay?
And then when the little report comes out, we will start our meeting.
Right, that's what I'm kind of hoping.
That is pretty cool.
So, first of all, I am so glad we have the same people, and if it changes, if you're listening, that's okay too, but I just love the people we have on this committee, so thanks for all being here. And since I'm a power-hungry chair and an English teacher, I just thought we should start with a poem. And I'm going to read you a poem.
Oh boy!
Because I just saw it and I liked it.
There's
and
no socks
like
included with this.
Are you ready?
This is one you've written or you found?
Oh, this is not my poem. This is somebody who's dead, Ella Wheeler Wilcox. Are you ready? It's called The Year. What can be said in a New Year rhyme that's not been said 1,000 times? The New Year's come, the old years go. We know we dream. We dream, we know. We rise up laughing with the light. We lie down weeping with the night. We hug the world until it stings. We curse it then and sigh for wings. We live, we love, we woo, we wed. We wreathe our brides, we sheet our dead. We laugh, we weep, we hope, we fear. And that's the burden of the year. I just feel like there's going to be a lot going on in standards this year, and we are going to rise to the challenge. So with that, why don't we introduce ourselves and then get busy with the work? Why don't we start with board member Hicks?
Scott Hansen, District 2, that's Ogden and Waiver.
Janet Cannon, District 8. I represent large parts of Grand District.
Okay, Mark Marsh, I'm District 12. I go from Daggett all the way to Orem and over to Summit County.
Oh, I'm Amy Magruder, and I'm just shadowing Nora Lee so she can go on vacation once in a while. And I'm Darren Nielsen's assistant.
Nora Lee Green, and I am the committee secretary.
Lee Voorhees, Assistant Superintendent of Student Support.
Darren Nielsen, Assistant Superintendent of Student Learning.
Jenny Gravitt, I represent District 4, which is Ogden and Weaver a little bit. And I'm also a junior high teacher. Yeah. Let's go around here too as well.
I'm Brian Olmstead, Coordinator here at the State Board of Education.
Items 1, 2, 3 on our
Items
agenda.
1, 2, 3.
I'm Max Lang, I'm an education specialist here working with State School Turnaround and School Improvement under Esea.
Leslie Evans, I also work with State School Turnaround and School Improvement.
Rebecca Donaldson, I'm the Student Support Coordinator here at USPB.
I'm Robert Austin, I'm the K-12 Social Studies Specialist at State Board.
Jennifer Thronson, Director of Teaching and Learning here at State Board.
Hi, I'm Rich Young with Pearson. Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Megan Russell, Legislative Intern for the State Board.
Jeff Van Holten, Policy Advisor for the State Board.
Samuel Allen, Internal Audit.
Wendy Morton, CTE Coordinator. Talia Longhurst, Director of Career Technical Education. Hi, Brian.
Sarah Jones, I represent UEA.
Brian Questenberry, Legal Counsel for the board.
Okay, well thanks everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started with our first item, which we have Brian come up to the table and Jeff. This one is R277733, which is involving the adult ed programs, and Brian and Jeff will explain it, but I think my understanding is correct. It's going to allow for more appropriate budgeting. We had to add something from 735, and we're going to let them talk first, then we'll answer questions. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you everyone. So the first three items are all connected to item 1, essentially. What we're doing here, this is the adult education rule. You'll recall earlier in 2019, we had this rule up for continuation. We decided to do some editing to it and kind of condense it down and incorporate by reference into the rule the policies and procedures manual that pretty much outlines all of the requirements for adult ed. So instead of having a 50-page rule, a 50-page manual, it's incorporated by reference. So it is part of the rule. 25, which is better. Yes. And that policy and procedures manual has been updated. They've been going through the year in 2019, making all of the necessary updates to that manual. So now we can bring the rule back to you. We're ready for you. None of the edits to 733 have changed since you last saw it back in March. What has changed, however, is Rule 735, the corrections education rule, was related to a contract that the legislature got rid of. So we are now deleting that rule and taking the one relevant piece of that rule that still would be necessary for corrections education and adding it into 733. And you may be asking, why would you do that? The rule in 735 incorporated by reference the policies and procedures manuals for adult ed to govern corrections ed. So it's essentially being governed now by the same set of policies, and we just thought we'd move it all into one rule rather than having it all split out. Condense the admin code by one. And then 702 will have some corresponding edits related to what going in the updates that were in the manual. 702 also has some elements of adult ed in it, so we're just changing the names of a form essentially and taking out some in the manual.
So do you want them to ask questions about any of those rules, or do you want just us to stick with 733 at first?
I think it would be fair to open it to all three.
Okay, since they're all kind of interrelated. Do you have anything to add, Brian?
No, just that if we don't take action on 733, then the 735, 702 action wouldn't be necessary.
Okay.
But questions certainly about all of it because it's related.
Questions from committee members?
I just have one. So I like the policy manual that we have put together. I wondered about approvals, revisions, and controls on that. I noticed we have a ADA compliant and amended as of, and there's a date, but nothing really there that says someone has signed off on it or anything like that. What's the control process for this to keep it from changing without a revision to the rule?
So because it's incorporated by reference in the rule, the rule would have to be updated every time. And this committee and the full board would have to approve any changes to the manual. So that's essentially the control. And Brian, as the keeper of the manual, is aware that because it's incorporated by reference, any edit he makes has to come before all of you.
So would it be wise to have something that says approved by the rules committee as of this date or something, so that we have
Yes. So
a
on
stamp on there? I see the amended as of this date, but I don't know if we need to be even more precise about it.
Are you saying in the rule or on the manual
On the
itself?
manual.
Yes, I think that would make a lot of
That
sense.
matched to a reference in the rule.
So maybe on like the About This Guide page could also.
Up to you. I don't
Okay.
know where it is, just so it's identified in the rule which revision of this we're referring to, and then the revision matches what's in the rule.
It says somewhere like the January 2020 policy, so that we know which version.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions from committee members? Janet?
Mine are more specific. I'm online. So on line 586, I guess you were talking here about a non-resident eligible adult education student. So I'm assuming that means someone who's not incarcerated, correct? A non-resident? And then it says that they can have an individual agreement between an eligible provider and another state, and the eligible provider. So that is my question. So these education providers are an LEA, a church, a literary organization, and then it says a public housing authority. And so I'm just trying to get my brain around how a public housing authority is an education provider for someone.
So this eligible provider list mirrors the federal list of potential recipients of funding. So for our state funding, we, by statute, our eligible providers are LEAs. For federal money, these are the eligible providers according to federal designation. Right now, we only have LEAs, a library, and some nonprofit agencies that have applied. So your question's good. You know, how would a public housing authority become a recipient of federal adult ed dollars? They'd have to prove that they work with adults on literacy or numeracy, that they have an existing program. They have to show 2 years of effectiveness of a program. It would be pretty difficult, but it's possible.
So they're in there as a possibility
Yes.
because they're mentioned in federal legislation.
Right.
But there's more to it. I mean, they can't.
You can't just show up and demand funds. because, you know, and say, hey, I'm an eligible provider. We would
I'm
say,
a public housing authority.
right. We would say, great, let's look at your demonstrated effectiveness in working with adults to improve their literacy and on and on and on.
You have another question?
Yes, line 677. 677 talks about the adult education program tuition and fees. And I'm just wondering so my thought was that this education was pretty well state supported or federal supported. So who is charging these tuition and fees, and what are they charging, and who's paying them? I don't think incarcerated people or, you know, some of these who are eligible for adult education would be in the money. So.
Right. The only fees in incarcerated programs tend to be a diploma fee. So if you actually have a completion and you want, you know, a fancy diploma, they'll do that. Most jail or prison programs don't charge fees, but the typical community-based programs can charge up to $100 per year.
Okay.
And so they'll often break it into terms or quarters. Some don't charge any.
And the kids have to come up with it, the young adults.
Adults, they're often our biggest group is like 25 to 40. Mm-hmm. You know, so yeah, the adults come up with those fees. And not all programs charge fees. We have large programs that do and large programs that don't, small programs that do and don't.
So are the ones that aren't charging fees, how are they supported? Are they just supported through state
and federal? Yeah. Yep. It's just all budgeting decisions, as you can imagine. Different ways use funds in you know, fees are no one will generate a lot of money through fees.
Okay.
It's not a difference maker, if I can say it that way.
So would fee waiver provisions apply as
Yes,
well for this?
they do.
Right?
They do, because and these are fees that a local board has to have on their approved list.
So they would be eligible for this standard criteria?
Yeah.
Even charge. And then just another kind of technical question on line 714. Custodial status does not qualify an individual for services under the IDEA. So if these folks are in custody, then despite their age, because I believe IDEA services can extend through age 21?
Up to your 22nd birthday.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what this is stating is just the status of custody does not create a need for special ed services.
So if you had someone who was otherwise qualified for IDEA, like if they were mentally handicapped or something, and they happened to be in custody, they would not qualify for IDEA?
No, they do.
They do?
They do. This is saying that your custody status does not qualify you.
Okay.
Even though there's some major life activities.
Yes.
Right. You're there for a different reason. But no, we do child find services, everything, you know, in the adult ed programs. And we also, after age 22, then you work with the ADA rules. And so you'll help people with disabilities still beyond their IDEA eligibility.
Can I add one little detail that might be helpful? So your State Board of Education special education rules decrease the amount of time for an individual who is in custody for the assessment, the child find process. So if the student isn't already eligible for special education, but comes into custody, and anyone on the child and family team had a concern that the student might have a disability, that 45-day assessment timeline actually decreases for an individual in custody. a child or youth. So we have a shortened timeline for individuals who are in custody.
Janet, do you have other questions?
That's my questions.
Any other questions? If there are no other questions, I'm wondering if somebody would like to make a motion to approve R2777 through 3 draft 2. And if not, I'm going to move to approve R2777 through 3 draft 2 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. Any,
With an amendment to the.
and I don't know that, I don't know if it's
I don't
an
know if that's
official
an amendment or
amendment, but
just a
you'll do that,
administrative.
right? With
Yeah,
directing staff
and because
to
it's
put it
actually in the, it's in the guide.
Yeah,
It's
that's not on
incorporated
this.
in the rule, so.
Yeah, the rule already does reference. by
Yeah.
date,
Yeah.
So I think we're.
Okay, good clarification. Any discussion of that motion? Okay, all those in favor of that motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion passes unanimously, which brings us right to item number 2, which is to repeal R277735, the Corrections Education Program rule, just because it's what they already talked about. Does anybody have any discussion or questions to that, or would like to make a motion? Janet?
I'll make a motion that we repeal R277-735 on first reading and recommend the board approve it on second and final reading.
Okay, the motion before the committee is to repeal R277735 on first reading and recommend to the board to repeal the rule on second and final reading. Any discussion to that motion? Okay, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. And finally, number 3, this is R277702, the procedures for the Utah High School Completion Diploma. And again, it was just to add consistencies, a few editing changes, update the URL. But let's see if we have any specific questions or comments to this one from committee members. Janet?
Yeah.
I feel like that's a, you're raising your hand or doing a
Just
dance.
kind
It's a
of,
New Year
I'm
dance.
looking at my notes
I
on
like
this, and
it.
I'm just thinking, okay,
Brain
so.
break.
So, can you differentiate for me, like what a GED is and what an HSE
yes,
and
yes,
how that
yeah.
all works out?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, great question, because a lot of our references now are to high school equivalency. So
Yeah.
for many years, GED was the only option. It's no longer the only option. And so it actually is a brand, an item, it's a thing, where high school equivalency is a concept. And so Utah, through an RFP process, selected GED as their current high school equivalency. And so we're trying to align all of our language to reflect that because in the future, we may select a different one. And so we want to make sure that as we refer to the high school equivalency concept, we also recognize that right now GED is our Utah option. Does that help? And so you'll see.
So essentially, if you pass the GED, then you can get an HSE.
You have your high school equivalency, right?
Okay.
Yep. Successfully passing the GED earns you a high school equivalent.
And they used to get, before 2002, they used to get an exam certificate. And now we've changed that to being a completion diploma.
Yep. So
And what was your rationale?
So it was the state board. So effective July 1, 2009.
What was your rationale?
Yeah. So it was.
I was here.
Yeah. It was recognizing the equivalency, and also that if you make the choice to pursue the equivalency and are successful, you can't go back. You can no longer say, well, I was just kidding. Now I want to earn my diploma.
Yeah.
Because they're equivalent, and the board stating that, it made so you're finished, except in IDEA students. In their circumstances, they have additional choices.
Any other questions from committee members or comments?
we purged that GED term then from everything? Is it?
Well,
still
it's-
exist at some of our-
so
I understand
like-
that's become generic, right?
Yeah.
You've got your GED, that's your high school.
You know, because I would say no, we haven't. We're trying to, in our documents, we're trying to be careful to, you know, delineate the two things. But in our common vernacular around, you know, in our community, on lots of job, you know, applications, yeah. You know, you have your high school diploma, you have your GED, checkbox.
But as we go through, we should be watching for
Yeah.
that and try to flush that out of the system.
And help people understand, what a high school equivalency is. GED is the best known. Yeah, it's like a Kleenex. We'll never say, hand me a facial tissue.
Looking for a motion?
I'll move that we approve draft 1 of R277-702 on first reading and forward it to the board to approve as well.
Okay, the motion before the committee is to approve R277-702, draft 1 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. Any discussion to that motion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion passes unanimously. Thanks.
You bet. Would it be appropriate to have the minutes reflect that we did 3 agenda items in 15 minutes?
Not only that, we're going to give our first ever award. Darren, did you bring it? It's a crystal ball, and it's for you. Called Speed Round. I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's because you're so, well, just wonderful. Okay. All right. Pressure's on now, guys. Now we gotta move to action item number 4, Utah Perkins 5 state plan. And I do believe Talia is coming up. And Wendy, sorry.
You're fine. I'll answer to whatever.
No, I do too at school. Sometimes I don't want to, but I do.
Yep.
Once I got called fish for the record.
Oh.
Better than the other one.
Right? Could be worse.
Okay, so, sounds like this is our plan that's due back.
Yes.
The feds in April.
Yes.
And we've been working on this, and why don't you talk to us about it?
Excellent. Talia Longhurst, Director of Career and Technical Education. For the record, I was often known as Cheese throughout my growing up years.
Oh, okay.
Because Talia is a very difficult name, so
Cheese.
my swim coach called me Cheese, so
Okay.
welcome.
Fish.
I'll
Cheese,
answer
meat,
to all of
fish,
it,
fish,
yes.
Cheese.
There you go. So we're here today to talk about the Perkins 5 state plan. Just to bring you back a little history here. In July of 2018, Congress passed and President Trump signed into law the Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act, working title known as Perkins 5. The Perkins Law has been around since 1917 and is in various iterations, and it represents continued emphasis and funding around career and technical education by the federal government. For the state of Utah, it means approximately $15 million annually that comes to the state. We split that between secondary and post-secondary career and technical education programs, and that is a significant amount of money for those who receive it and how we use it. I think I'll probably steal some notes that Wendy had, but I'll jump in because it seems timely. With the coming census that needs to happen, Perkins funding is based around our census data. And so it is one of those things that relies heavily on census. 30% is based on just who lives in our state and how many people, students in this case, live in our state. But also then 70% is based on poverty level. Of those students or adults, secondary versus post-secondary, how many of them are living in poverty? So it is a census and poverty-based funding formula, and that is true of all of the states. Yeah, so.
So is the split, when we get the grant, is it split already, or do we just decide to split?
Split.
Once we receive the money between secondary?
Right, so that's a great question. And that is something that we revisited in this round of Perkins 5. We were really encouraged by the federal government, by our national organizations that we work with, to not just do a copy and a paste of Perkins 4. And that was really, really great advice and something that we took to heart. And we worked very extensively with our post-secondary partners to really think about how to emphasize the things that Perkins 5 really wants us to emphasize, and how to continue to divide that money up to serve the students of the state of Utah. We've always had, at least historically as far as I go back, and I've been at this almost 30 years now. I know, right? And I'm only 29, so I don't know how that actually calculates. But we've always, as far as I know, done a 60-40 split, 60% secondary, 40% post-secondary. After extensive talking, Assistant Superintendent Nelson was in a lot of our discussions. We've revisited that amount, and we have decided, based on a lot of different components, to maintain that 60-40 split. And Wendy can explain why as we go through that and answer questions for you.
But again, that split is ours. The money comes in one lump.
Yes, we are the eligible, USBEU are the eligible recipient from the federal government. So we get that, we have to determine, that's outlined in our plan and the reasons for that. And then Wendy will go through the specifics, but there's specific amounts of money that flow. Most of the money flows out of here. We keep very little money here just to oversee and monitor the grant.
And while we're on that topic, maybe would now be a good time to talk about like why
Sure.
the 60-40 split? Or,
Sure.
Yeah.
So with the 60-40 split, some of the things that happened in Perkins 5 were that at the secondary level, there's additional grades that then were opened up. So previously under Perkins 4, students in grades 7 through 12 were able to receive services or programs that serve students in grades 7 through 12. Under Perkins 5, that opens up and in basically grades 5 through 12. And so in our plan, you'll see that we've identified grades 6 through 12 because of how CTE is administered in the state. At the middle school, junior high level, there's not really very many fifth grade in a school, but we do have a few K-12s, 7-12s, 5-12 kinds of schools. So you'll see in the plan that we've referenced 6 through 12 in Utah, which we're allowed to be a little more restrictive if we choose to, but it was based off of students, how schools are structured. And so in the plan, we've referenced grades 6 through 12. So there's more students potentially at the secondary level that would then receive additional services potentially under this plan. Also, you have at the post-secondary level, there's additional funding sources, tuition, industry partnerships, some additional funding that flows. The portion that the post-secondary institutions receive is very small from Perkins compared to what they receive overall for their functioning budgets. And in talking with them, they were comfortable with the split as it is. They didn't have any concern about pushing more money into post-secondary level. They were comfortable with where we were. There's also more reporting requirements at the secondary level than you'll see at post-secondary, as you'll see in this plan. So there's a little more accountability requirements at the secondary level. So we felt like it was a fair split.
Thank you. Jenna?
Why did they decide to open it up into grade 5?
I don't know.
Well,
The school.
yeah.
Well,
I think the belief is, and actually, quite honestly, I would agree with this, that you need to prepare students earlier.
Yeah.
Students need to be aware at an earlier age. If they want to go out and do an apprenticeship, starting as a junior in high school, they need to be on track to graduate. They need to not be credit deficient. They need to have their math skills up to date. They need to know and start thinking about these things early on. Not that they have to commit to something, but they need to be preparing themselves so that as they're moving through the systems, that they're ready and understanding where they need to go and what needs to happen, and that they're ready to get there.
I would also add that we do know that participation in CTE programs at an early age increases student engagement. And so knowing that students tend to decide whether they want to stay in school or not stay at school, beginning at earlier and earlier ages, exposure to additional courses that could increase their student engagement levels is important to then offer them. And I do know those discussions were part of it as well.
Any other questions or comments from committee members? Well, then we are looking for an action to forward this recommendation to the board, this plan.
I'll make a motion then that we recommend that this Perkins and state versus state plan be moved forward to the board for final approval.
Okay, thank you. The motion before the committee is to make a recommendation to the board for the full board for approval of the Utah Perkins 5 state plan. Any discussion to that motion?
I probably should make one comment before you make your final vote. You probably will see a slightly edited version of this document come for the full board approval next month, because we're in the middle of public comment right now. We don't expect any major shifts philosophically, but we know there might be some grammar things, a few definitions that we need to add in. So it will differ ever so slightly,
Will
but
those
not.
be in a different color for us, or?
It would, whatever you prefer.
I mean, that
We
might
can
make
do that,
nice
yes.
so that we can see. So
Yep.
it was kind of a long read. And then you
Yes.
can just kind of scan through and look for blue.
Yes.
You don't want to reread it and guess what the changes. We'll do that for you.
Of course I
absolutely.
do. But
Yes.
Yeah. So just so you know,
Thank you
it
for
might
that.
be a little bit different.
Yeah.
Okay. All those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you so much. So much hard work. Good job. You almost finished.
I'm going to just say that we did.
You're
I'll
gonna
go
take
find
that
Brian
crystal ball
right
and
now.
smash it in half.
That's right.
But we don't.
Brian
have
and I
to
are not
worry.
competitive.
Oh, really? Who's competitive? Oh, Jennifer. She's.
I own it.
I feel like she'll take all
It's
of
on.
them. Okay.
Now, when you consider the length of the plan, I would say that.
Well, that's true.
Must be 76 pages per
Could you
page.
keep
around.
like
Thank you, Darren. Thank you very much.
Yes, we got it. Team Perkins?
Yeah.
Team. All right, where are we? Guys, here, moving along, not that we have to, I just want to say that's good. Okay, we are now on action, item number 5, R277108, the annual assurance of compliance by local school boards amendment. And you guys have seen this before, and we have a lot to do with this, a lot to do maybe in the future, maybe now, but Jeff, will you talk to us about it?
Yes, and maybe rather than being the math teacher that goes the hard route and then once you figure it out, tell you that there's a better way.
Yeah.
I will not lead up to the ultimate announcement, but instead just let you know that we met with the Utah State Superintendents Association.
Yeah.
They were given this list a while ago as well, and their feedback to us as of this week was our concern about this list is less about the content and more about the timeline in which you require us to fill it out.
Yeah.
And we would prefer it be a longer timeline. And with that said, they would actually prefer that there be a longer working group so they can give more feedback on this list. And they have said that they are fine to do status quo for 1 more year so that we get this right. So that is where they are currently standing. I told them that I would communicate that. They would have been here to do that, but because of their conference that started today, they are not in attendance here. But with that, I will walk you through what we've done so far, and then we can kind of decide, as the committee can decide what they would prefer to do.
Okay, great, thanks.
As you can kind of see on board civic clerk, I've done that multiple times now. I really love board
We're
docs.
gonna get cards and put money.
So
And then we'll buy board backs.
Yeah.
Actually, didn't say that.
What we did is we made a Google Doc, and anything that is in blue and white, I just differentiated the rows blue and white so they'd be easy to see each other from, is a state code requirement, whether it's state code, or a board rule, or both. If it's in green and white, it is a federal requirement. What we came to discover is this document originally was created for the green portions, for the federal assurances. Because there are requirements in federal regulations for the vast majority of these that there needs to be some type of forward-looking promise from an LEA that they will do the following federal requirements in the upcoming school year in order to qualify for the federal funding. With that in mind, we have also overlaid onto this document over time, and it's continued to grow, state requirements in the assurances document as well. So the document as you see it, you've got the actual assurance pulled straight from the document. Yeah.
I'm just gonna pause. So it's not in our civic clerk anymore, but if you guys go to the audit report this morning, you will see the assurances document. And then you'll see what he's talking about with green, et cetera.
Yes, I apologize.
Because I can see them all looking and they are not seeing green.
If you go to the audit section from this morning's, and it's labeled as R277702.
Yes.
Which is incorrect. It's 108, but it's labeled on Civic Clerk as 702.
Okay, continue. Didn't mean to interrupt, Jeff.
Yeah,
I just
no,
wanted
you're
to
totally
be on the
fine.
right place.
Once you feel comfortable that you have it up, I can start walking you through.
Here it is.
Blink once if you have it up. Just kidding. Do what you want.
So I've got the assurances in the far left. the code references according to the assurance document currently that the assurance is related to, and then the current line of evidence we require. There are really only 2 lines of evidence we currently require. It's either a link to a policy or there is no line of evidence at all, and it's just the assurance document that they're checking a yes or a no on. Next to that, we as staff went through and put in recommended lines of evidence. There were a whole host of assurances that are assurances that policies exist, but we were not asking for a link to the policy. We thought at a bare minimum we'd make that consistent. If we're talking about a policy, we need a link to the policy. There are a couple deviations from the policy idea. You'll notice on the 3rd row down, the 2nd blue row, it's about the minimum school days. And we put that a line of evidence, you could put your school calendar as the evidence for that as well. So that's that column. The next column over is any additional compliance that we do outside of the assurance document already for these assurances to make sure that they are being followed and adhered to. The conversation is not settled, but there definitely was a conversation of, well, if we're already doing other things, do we also need the assurance? For the federal things, yes. For the state things, the conversation is kind of up in the air in terms of one or the other. Next to that, we also asked staff, how are you using the information that's coming in from the assurance document? There's one line of thinking too as we looked at this was, is there a reason why we're asking outside of a requirement to ask? And is anyone even using the yes or the no responses? It was a mixed bag. Some staff do not look at the assurance that might be related to their area. Other staff, this is the only way that they know that something is happening without requiring some additional reporting from a program. So it was it depends. And then you have another column with other notes and thoughts as well from the staff. I would say overall that there is a good chunk of the state ones where the staff is not currently looking into the yes or no responses. So I will just let that be what it is, and you guys can decide how you feel about that. And in lieu of all of this conversation and what we talked about, Darren, myself, and Deputy Jones were speaking about earlier in the full board meeting, there are some other projects going on now that were not going on when we started this one. One of the big ones now is creating a master list of all requirements. Reporting requirements being a subset of that. As this audit looked at reporting requirements, then there's also all of your legal requirements that may not even be a report. So we're currently now undergoing this whole work in the next, hopefully 12 months, to get a good comprehensive list of, if you're an LEA, here are all of your legal requirements, including reporting. From that list, the reason I bring that up is a lot of questions that came up from staff was, well, if we do that, the reason why I asked for this to be on the assurance document was to remind people that it's a requirement. And you'll notice as you read through this, and I'm sure Board Member Hanson has seen this as he's brought this up to our attention, there is really no rhyme or reason as to which requirements made the list versus all the ones that aren't there in terms of reminder. So that's kind of like, I feel like I'm giving you a very incomplete story at this point in terms of where we're at. And I think it's mostly because all of these other, the audit started to conclude and the Speaker of the House also made some requests saying, I want to know what are the full requirements of an LEA and do you really need more staff and funding to adhere to all of that? Is it the legislature's fault or is it the board's fault for putting it all in rule? And we're just beginning that process. As well as the Superintendent's Association is requesting at least another month, but they would prefer to just do status quo one more year and incorporate the master list and this into one big working group.
I just keep thinking from the school or the LEA's perspective, how useful if we get this right, like to have this list. I mean, can you imagine being a new LEA? Just think we need to do it right. What questions, Scott?
A couple. First, I understand everything kind of got ahead of this, and now everything's kind of converging. And it probably doesn't make sense to rush something and it's gonna be revised later, so I would support moving forward with the caveat that if there's anything that you've seen so far that's like flashing at you that says we need to change this, we probably ought to sneak that in and get it into this year's. I don't know.
There wasn't anything that seemed like it needed to be deleted immediately. There's not necessarily harm in keeping some of these. There are a couple of rules that have passed in the last 6 to 7 months that required a couple of things be added.
So those should be added.
So those should be added, but
Mhm.
but those could also be pulled out again once we review and say, well, why did we? It's because they are put in board rules. So the board elected to have these things put on the assurance document.
Okay, so that, I have a couple of questions going forward, if that's okay. So as we have all these things come together, I think it's important to get a statement of purpose for them.
Great.
Whether it's a reminder or whether it's, because it's in code it's required. And then you made a statement this morning about forward-looking versus confirmation.
Yes.
And forward-looking is a lot less valuable to me
Yep.
generally than
Right.
confirmation of, if someone's assuring someone, say assure that it's been done, not assuring that it's going to be done. And then no follow-up, is what I understand, right? The next year, we're assuring again that it's going to be done, even if it wasn't done the last year after we assured that it would be done.
Correct.
So just that thought from me. Also, if we're confirming something somewhere else, and then that assurance, which is a standalone assurance, if that drops off, we'd have to be sure to catch that and feed it back into, it's important. When we start farming it out to various areas, then those could drop off without us knowing, I guess.
Fair.
And then we lose that assurance, even though maybe being assured now. Maybe when you said that a lot of the staff may not be using the assurance document, I wonder if we have some valuable confirmation document or something there, if it would be more useful to staff rather than just a checkbox. And maybe as we think about what is the link or the assurance that they, the evidence they put in, maybe we could ask staff what's valuable to them and see if that's feasible to include as the evidence. I've exhausted my list, Janet.
Oh, okay. I'm just thinking, even if you're looking at patterns, like here are the patterns of things that LEs are missing, or like, and it's more to instruct and to educate and to remind, and I can see it being valuable not only to be confirmation, but also to have documents that says forward-looking. Here are the things we're going to be looking for next year that you're going to assure. Like if I were in charge, I would want to know the beginning, and then I would want to assure at the end.
I think these links to model policies, or links to their policies, and creating model policies are going to be extremely valuable.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you're just going click,
Do it
click,
right,
click, and
so-
see.
Sorry,
whatever
Janet,
it's
I know you
doing.
had some questions.
Okay.
You covered my question.
Of course he did.
I know, I just concerned about the backward, forward thing too.
Oh, okay.
So just
Darren,
make a comment. I was responsible for completing the assurance list of my prior employer. The superintendent delegated that to me, and
Oh, you're so
we
lucky.
viewed it because I had 3 superintendents in 5 years, 3 superintendents, one of which came from out of state. So the document was good. It was
So you were hard on superintendents?
It was, yeah. I hope that's over with. Anyway, it was your statement of purpose. That's really
I love
resonated.
that.
That really resonated with me because we viewed it in the LEA, at least the LEA I worked in. It's just like, oh, you got to be aware of these really critical elements. And we knew it wasn't comprehensive, that there were other things, and lots of monitoring and auditing going on outside of that. And then when I got here, a lot of the staff I work with, the reason they wouldn't use the assurance, I wasn't surprised a lot of staff don't reference. I was actually surprised any staff here ever looked at the assurance document. Because I didn't believe that was why it was created. Because again, each program has their own controls in place generally, especially where they're required by the board or the state or the feds. So that statement of purpose, I think, is critical to help and guide us. As we've been discussing internally, I've been getting confused about what is it we're trying to do. I don't know why that policy was passed in the first place, the assurance document, and then why certain things are on there and certain things aren't. There's lots of vagueness in my mind.
Oh, thank you for that. Jeff, do you have anything else to add? Just
No, just in terms of moving forward in regard to action items today, if you want to go forward with status quo for a year, we do need to pass the rule with the updated list.
Yeah, we need
Just to incorporate the new things.
So, but that's not as it is, right? You've got to create the new assurance document.
Correct. So that would come back in February.
Yeah.
Do we need to move, or we just need to
We
have
do need
staff
to
do that?
we need to approve 108, correct?
With the January
With-
2020 list,
Yes, with the
which would not be what's before you. It would be, well, it would be that with the two additions that we have from board rules this year.
Yeah.
And then any direction that you guys would like to give in terms of the working group, because the working group is now going to take on the task of all requirements, including reporting requirements, and try and see if there's possibilities for streamlining, and also to build upon the audit's recommendations, eventually go to the legislature and find things we can eliminate, things we can merge. It's going to be a big undertaking, but I think it'll be very helpful at the end of the day.
And I'm sure this would already be in place, but I know we'd want updates as to what's going on and that things
Yes.
are progressing. And
So I guess I'm still, do we need to have a motion this time, or do you want to come
Yes.
back next month with the, I mean, this isn't time sensitive. If you have the update, we just pass it next month, and we're okay time-wise?
We would need to pass it out of committee this
Today.
month.
Yeah.
Yep.
I will make the motion then that we approve the assurance document, or the assurance section, the assurance rule as is, with the assurance document updated to include the recent rules.
Okay, yeah, I think so. So let me make sure I have this right, and Norley, you correct me if I'm wrong. The motion before the committee is to approve R277-108 draft 1 on first reading with the January 2020 updated list.
Correct.
Okay.
I just have a question.
Any discussion of that motion?
Yeah.
No.
So, I was looking at the rule, now I'm in the audit thing and I don't have the rule, but it said the document was amended. And when I looked through for something in blue, and I was reading through there, all I could find was the date.
Correct.
That was
That's- I
in
think
blue,
that's-
so is that the only amendment
Yes.
there? Okay, I just wanted to verify that.
Okay, good clarification. Any other questions or discussion of the motion? Okay, so again, the motion is before the committee is to approve R277-108 on first reading with the January 2020 updated list. And then forward that recommendation to the full board. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Cool. All right, our next one is an information item, the preschool entry and exit profile. I felt like it should have been you, because you're little people. That's why I looked at you.
Our whole team.
I know, but I'm just like, well, you're little people too.
Right?
Okay. Cindy.
Hello. I'm Sydney Carter, I'm the Assessment Development Coordinator here at the USBE. And this is just an information item. I'm not sure if I have a PowerPoint presentation attached. Would you like me to post it as well?
That'd be great.
I love, this is called Pete.
I do too.
Oh my gosh, you came up with that.
Well, 'cause it rhymes
That
with
was
Pete.
actually Jennifer.
And the next
Right?
one, for junior high students, it's going to be called Sleep.
There you go. That'd be perfect. Yes, yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for the note.
That's what I was thinking. Yes, thank you.
And our graphic designer did make our manual with peeps inside. She had a lot of fun with the graphic design of the peep. So I wanted to come just for an information item to let you know about the PEEP assessment, the preschool entry and exit profile. So this assessment is something that is administered to students that have their schools are participating in one of two different grants. So Jamie and Jessica are here. They work with the Becoming High Quality School Readiness Grant programs, as well as the Expanding Students Access to High Quality School Readiness programs. So it's two different grants that look at preschool programs that are trying to become high quality, and then the second one is those that are already high quality to expand those programs. There's two different codes that go along with this grant. So this assessment is required for the LEAs that participate or that receive the funding from the grants to administer to the students in those programs. There's another code that talks about the actual assessment and developing the assessment. In that code, it talks about the entry was developed by a partnership between our assessment department, the teaching and learning department, and our partners with DWS, as well as teacher educators giving a lot of feedback and as well as university experts on early childhood on what items we should include in the assessment. This fall was our pilot. So in August and September, we administered the assessment to just over 6,000 students.
How did you do that? Did you?
Yeah, so we did. We developed the assessment, and then we trained LEAs and educators to administer the assessment. It's given one-on-one, so an administrator with the student. It's meant to take less than 20 minutes as they administer the assessment to the kids. And then we worked really closely with our IT department to be able to develop a data entry tool that they could enter their data into the system. And they could do it one of two ways. They could do it paper pencil if they felt more comfortable and then coming in later to enter the data. Or we actually have pretty much the test administration manual online where they can enter the data live as they administer the assessment. So depending on how tech savvy the administrator is, they were able to do that.
Do you have any feeling for how much paper and pencil was used versus the tech?
You know, we don't know. It'd be something that probably would be useful to get a survey out and just ask people. I think the majority of people did paper pencil, and just not as many preschool teachers are as tech use tech as often as older grade teachers. So the majority of the feedback that we heard, and I'm looking to Jessica and Jamie because they work with those providers often, was that many of them did paper pencil. They like to have that paper copy that they keep in their records. And at this point, we don't have reports for the individual students, so that could be something that could be a report for the parents as well. With the PEEP assessment, there's basically two levels. So as we look at this early childhood, there's not a whole lot of dividing out where the students are. So it was either, as we worked with our partners with DWS and with educators in the field, we determined there would be two performance levels. So the first would be they're at benchmark, they're meeting the expectation that we would expect for students that were entering into a 4-year-old preschool. And the second level is that they need support. The students receive a separate designation for both literacy and numeracy. So they may be at benchmark for numeracy, but need support in literacy and vice versa. This grant, one thing I failed to mention on this first slide, the grant is available for both public and private preschool providers. So that led to a few issues as we were trying to figure out how do we gather the data on students that are attending one of the private schools that are receiving the grant funding. So we had to work really closely with our IT team to determine how do we get SSID numbers for students that are attending private schools, private preschools, and then how do we create a school for that private preschool and roster students. So we ended up having to do that manually. So that was a lift for the LEAs and the private school providers to have to manually roster their students, which is something that they don't do for anything else. But it was one way that we were able to make sure that people had access to give us the data and to help the data keep as clean as possible. We were able to develop the performance level descriptors, and this is used in the standard setting process. So that's another attachment that was on the agenda. But the PLDs, or the performance level descriptors, describe what a student in each category would look like. So you can see in the support needed category, a student in kindergarten, entering pre-kindergarten, or the 4-year-old kindergarten, would be classified as support needed if in literacy they would identify few to no correct objects in a picture, so a vocabulary question. They demonstrate few to no concepts of print, versus a student at benchmark entering pre-kindergarten classified as at benchmark would be able to identify most objects in a picture, demonstrate some concepts of print, identify letters, some letters of the alphabet. So these were used in the process of standard setting. So in standard setting, we use those PLDs and we look at actual student responses and how students answered every question. And we did something called the card sorting method, where we take those student responses and basically just sort them into two piles. Are they at benchmark or are they a need support student? And so we were able to determine where that cut score would fall based on actual student data. And we followed this process. It's a legally defensible process that we worked with our partners at the Center for Assessment who led us through the standard setting process. We had about 20 educators, including our staff, DWS, and educators and preschool providers from the field that participated in that standard setting to determine where that cut score should be between at ready and support needed, at benchmark and support needed. So just a little bit of basics about the assessment. There are 3 sections to the assessment. We put cut scores, or we determined cut scores for the literacy section and the numeracy section. In the literacy section, there's 8 questions, and you can see up on the screen the different questions for each in the literacy category. The questions are based on standards for the 3-year-old standards. So the foundational skills for 3-year-old students, because it's given at the beginning of their 4-year-old year. So we would expect them to have mastered the 3-year-old standards. So that's where all the questions were written from, those standards. We looked specifically, had a few questions in the literacy section on number 4 and number 7. So letter recognition and letter sounds. And I'll talk about those in just a minute. Numeracy had 6 questions. And as we looked at numeracy and worked with our partners and educators and experts in the field of early numeracy to determine what were the best questions that we can assess that match a standard, and that are something that are predictive of future success for the students. That's how we determined items that we would put on the assessment. So in doing the standard setting, we had a couple of questions from panelists. They had some concerns over that question for the letter naming and the letter sounds. Originally in our materials, although we didn't expect students to know all 26 letters at 4 years old, we didn't have a great way of determining which letters they should or shouldn't know. We didn't want to give an unfair advantage if your name started with a Z and we didn't have the letter Z there. And so we wanted to make sure we gave every student the opportunity to look at each letter and determine which letters they knew. But we left it open to 26 points because we wanted to see what the actual data was before we cut that scoring down for both letter naming and letter recognition. And so each of those were originally worth 26 points for a total of 71 points on the literacy section. After we administered the assessment, we looked at the actual student responses to determine how we should break out the points. And also that 26 points for each of those letter naming and 26 for letter sounds really weighed heavily those 2 questions and outweighed the other questions that are each worth 1 or 2 or 3 points. And so we were able to look at actual student data and determine how we would rescore those. So you can see here letter names, we've moved down. It was about 20% of students in each of these different groups when we broke it down. So now it's worth 4 points instead of 26, and students who are able to name 20 to 26 letters would get the 4 points, 7 to 19 letters would get 3 points, and so on. The same thing with letter sounds, although letter sounds is a lot more difficult because the students in earlier grades, oftentimes they know letters before they know sounds, but as far as reading, knowing sounds is better because you need to be able to decode words, and so that's something that they should know, but it may not be something that they've learned up to that point. So letter sounds was a little bit different. We had 56% of the students had 0 letter sounds, whereas the cut up to 4 points was 4 to 26 letter sounds that they knew. So we were able to adjust the scoring on those 2 points and make them both worth 4 points each instead of 26 points each. And finally, here was the impact data. So after we went through all of the standard setting and determining where we felt like students should be at benchmark versus needing support, it ended up, out of the 31 points total in literacy, we ended up with a cut score of 21 to be at benchmark. That was 29.9% of the students that participated in the assessment. Numeracy was 32 points possible, and the benchmark, the cut score, was 24 points, and that ended up being 47 points. This is similar to what we see with KEEP, where a lot more students are at benchmark in numeracy than they are at literacy. But this is where the educator team and our team felt like we could say that students were at benchmark. I think that's it.
So interesting. Questions from committee members?
Do you have the results of how the 6,000 students did?
Yeah, so that's what's posted here. It's the 29% on literacy were at benchmark when the cut score was at 21 out of 31, and then 47.5% on numeracy were at benchmark. So, and knowing that this program is helping to serve students that are underserved and a lot of preschools, this preschool is, can you help me, Jessica, with the students that are participating
So the
in the
grants
program?
really are just funding the eligible students at this point. So they're either economically disadvantaged with at least one risk factor, or they're an English learner. So you're kind of expecting to see those lower.
Yeah, and this is just first half of the PEEP. So the real purpose of the PEEP is to be able to do what's one of the most difficult things to do, and that is measure how much learning occurred and try to attribute it to the program, preschool program. So the exit, the kindergarten entry, which will be the PEEP exit test, will be administered this spring. And then we'll try to, people who are over those programs, will try to determine how effective those programs are at doing that very thing, which is so hard to measure.
Are these kids fairly stable in the, I mean, does the same cohort move all the way through the class, or do we have kids swapping in and out?
Yeah, that's a good question. Jessica, can you answer that? Jessica Smith, preschool specialist. We're in the process of really monitoring the attendance data. As far as like my experience in the classroom and talking with others, it does. We have a high turnover rate as well as high. I guess they miss a lot of school. I can't think of how to say that. Low attendance. Yes, there we go. Thank you.
Just seems like truancy.
I know, right? No, just helping families to realize that preschool is important as well, and our little friends don't know how to, keep germs to themselves. So we have a lot more sick kids out. But the main goal of We've Told programs that if an eligible student leaves the program, that they need to fill that seat, so that we're funding that seat and hopefully, benefiting. And some preschool is better than no preschool. So we're hoping, especially as we get the PEEP data and start analyzing the effectiveness of preschool attendance, is something that we absolutely have to take into account. So we're working on how we can track that as well.
I'm just thinking about the effect of the second part of the assessment. If we have a high turnover rate, a lot of these kids won't have the benefit of the whole year. And I don't know how we measure effectiveness of that. Maybe somebody's got a formula there. That's one that we can.
We're anticipating only pulling kids for those attendance. Attendance matters, so we'll look at how many days they attended and then start to play with the data. Okay, is 60 days enough to show impact and kind of that, because it is so variable. It's a huge variable in preschool.
Yeah, in our state accountability, it's 160 days, so students to be enrolled in their school for 160 days for their results to count in that school's.
Preschool's 2 days a week, so it's not ever going to be anywhere.
I know they miss a lot. I hope we can build a population.
A lot of our programs are 2 or 3 days a week, so you're not even looking at a 180 calendar day. So what we're going to start to do is just kind of squeeze the data until we find a compelling number of days that seems to have a changing factor. It's kind of the anticipated plan.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you. And as one question, as we heard back from LEAs about the assessment in general, we heard pretty positive information about the test. Like we said, one of the things that we heard consistently concern was the manual entering of the data and the amount of time and manpower that took to enter the data and roster those students manually. We're working with our IT team to determine there were some issues because we have private providers as well as public and LEA school or LEAs participating. So we're looking if it's possible that just the LEAs, we could roster them automatically like we do with all the rest of our assessments, and then it would just be the private providers. If it's a small change, our IT department will be able to do that. If it's a larger change, we'll be going to our data governance to see how we can ease that burden from the people that participated in the grant.
Were there any other major concerns with people who administered the PEEP?
Not necessarily. I think the concern originally with the scoring of 26 letters and thinking that we were expecting 26 letters and 26 sounds. So I think that will be appeased as we get the new scoring rules out as well.
And if you go back to this morning's discussion about the excessive reporting, the way they define reporting in that audit, this is brand new reporting requirement for those who are participating in the program, which points to the time issue that teachers are feeling and school are feeling.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So you can just get started. It's been identified as an action item, but
Yeah.
not actually a discussion item. I don't know the
So the
parliamentary
elementary
procedures, no, the social studies.
Yeah, that's when you did elementary social studies.
Yeah, there's a defined process, and we're the timeline where this will be.
Okay, so we don't need to accept the, I thought that when I read it.
Yeah, I'm not
Because
sure how to
originally-
change that as far as parliamentary.
Well, how about we just change it?
Okay.
I mean, so this next item, you might see action, but you're reading it incorrectly. It says information. I don't know, does somebody know how we?
It's a discussion item, so
discussion,
the policy requires discussion, but not an action to be taken.
Well, Numeracy is discussion.
I didn't catch it when it came through, and it's my bad.
When I looked at it, I was like, I didn't remember doing an action.
There's no
when we
action,
had
it's
these
just a little
similar-
discussion, you can give us feedback,
Okay.
but yeah.
Well, we're gonna have a discussion on the Elementary Social Studies Standard Review Committee recommendations. And we've got Robert Austin and Jennifer Johnson.
Hello, I'm Robert Austin. I'm the K-12 Social Studies Specialist. Delighted to be here. I mean, I know it's a tough act to follow, PEEP, but...
Maybe you could come up with a
well, you know, how about
I mean,
social...
Jennifer.
I think social studies is pretty awesome. So, you know, social studies is actually one of the favorite subjects of many of us in elementary school. We have really fond memories. I see the Pompeii exhibit at the Leonardo across... And I learned about Pompeii when I was in 4th grade in Mrs. Verkota's classroom. And 40 years later, to be able to actually, well, probably more like 45 years later, to actually go to Pompeii. But it was a lifelong desire because I'd actually learned about Pompeii, and I'd learned about Italy, and I'd learned about the world, and I'd learned about volcanoes. And so social studies is absolutely essential for students, for their understanding of the world, for navigating literacy, numeracy, all of the other disciplines. So just quickly let you know where we are in the standards review process. This is step number 5 of the delineated process that the state board has laid out. What happens at this point, and what I'm reporting on, is the fact that we requested 7 members of a standards review committee from the state board chair. Also then received names of 5 parents from the president of the Senate and 5 names from the Speaker of the House. And those 17 people then come together for a very lovely 2-meeting limit to a committee. Wouldn't you love a committee that you knew had a lifespan? So the committee met on November 25th and then again on December 16th. And their job is to really do a high-level flyover of the standards, to be able to look at standards, decide whether they deserve revision. And honestly, I don't think a standards review committee has come together that hasn't said something needs to be done. And that's a part of just the fact that we learn and we grow, and if we are lifelong learners, then documents are also going to change. Some of the standards that are being revised or recommended for revision were actually put together under my leadership 15 years ago. So what I thought, and actually what the superintendent at the time said about those standards was, it's a masterpiece. And I saved that email. I could probably find it if I had to. Well, it was a masterpiece 15 years ago, but it's not. But we've learned more, and there are things that we can do. So their recommendation, the Standards Review Committee met, and their recommendation was that the standards should be revised, not with a caveat of not a wholesale revision in terms of the probably even the kind of concept of an expanding universe, expanding horizons vision of learning, which is that you start with community, and as you get older, you move from an understanding of the local community and community helpers to the state, to the nation, and then to the world. And that's our sequence. It's really followed in many states across the country. It also then means that revision would align. It wouldn't be like one more wrench thrown into people's consistent 4th grade classroom that they have. But this will provide us a real opportunity to reiterate how important social studies is in the daily classroom. The reality is that as I visit elementary classrooms, there are many classes where social studies is relegated to an afterthought because of assessment and because of the kinds of focus on literacy and numeracy. What we know is that students learning about the world are going to do better on those other kinds of assessments. And so I'm hoping that as we revise, we will be able to get a better sense of the importance of social studies. The recommendations that they then listed here are understandable, doable, achievable, kind of exciting in terms of trying to think about how to weave all of that into a standards document. And so that's really all I have to say, other than I really want to thank the people on that standards review committee for their kind of civic engagement and their willingness to devote that time and attention to the process.
Committee members, you probably had a chance to look at some of their recommendations. I'm wondering if you have thoughts or questions or things you'd like to ask either Robert or Jennifer about them. Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, so I was looking through here and I thought one of the big parts of social studies would be geography. And you just have here attend to place name geography when appropriate.
Sure.
So do we need it to be more than that? I think one of the things my kids loved was the National Geographic Geography Bee.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was so exciting.
I get to MC that every year.
Oh.
So, right.
Yeah.
Right. So,
what kind of emphasis does geography have?
Right, sure. Geography is absolutely essential. Geography is in our existing standards. We infuse basically I think there's a little more relevant or a little more reference to the under alignment on the second page of that document. It talks about the consistent formatting in specific targeted areas, and that geography is absolutely essential. And we won't lose that. The specific piece was place name geography, and the idea of actually knowing where things are is an essential kind of building block skill that we want to make sure happens in the standards.
Okay, then one other piece, I was a little bit surprised to see financial literacy mentioned in social studies standards. So can you tell me about that?
Sure. There's actually a mandate to have a K-12 focus on personal financial literacy, and that came about after the 3.6 standards, but when the K-2 standards, which were done later, and so there's actually a little bit of financial literacy in the K-2, and then not so much in 3.6. And so the reviewers, as they noted that, they said, there seems to be a disconnect. Like, you talk about the importance of economics and just the importance of personal financial literacy, and then it just goes away. And so they just want to make sure that we bring that in.
So what kind of things would...
So like you could do like classroom economies. Mm-hmm. There could be some curricular, even things about both producers and consumers and understanding the economic concepts, but also just, how do people make money? What is the value of money? There's some concern always about making sure that people understand the free market system, capitalism, and larger social studies issues that are around that.
And one parent brought up trying to not even think about it from a money perspective, like how can you contribute that then provides some kind of service or support to your world? In a case of a kindergartner, I don't necessarily want to train them that you only do things because I give you money for that. But how does me doing that contribute to the broader society as part of, I would do some kind of work, which ultimately then leads to that financial part someday. But when you're 5, there's not that same. So trying to scale it for the age of the child as well. So thinking about how do we start to show them that work yields some kind of result, and sometimes that's a money effort, sometimes it's just contribution to your community. It's my lens.
Any other thoughts or discussion from committee members? Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to add a quick aside. I don't know if you have junior achievement here in Utah, but we participated in that with some of our schools in Iowa, and they have a great financial literacy sort of curriculum or sequence for many grade levels, and they introduce things like budgeting and planning and kind of get into some basic economics concepts. So I could see how that would fit in with the social studies.
A lot of our 5th graders participate in that.
That's when I did it.
Yeah.
That's right. There you go.
Machine.
We have the United Way Center downtown, and they get to go be the CEO for a day. It's fun.
Whatever your mask is.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Fun begins.
Excited to see what happens with that.
Thank you.
What's the next step now?
So we convene writers, and we begin the first drafts, and then we'll bring those back and start the process of getting feedback from the board.
So kind of what you've been through with preschool at this point, most recently.
Great. Thank you.
Good, excited. Okay, we're on to last the best of all the things, and that would be action item number 8. school turnaround, statutory changes. I think Anne Michelle and Tiffany and
Whole team. Max, let's
okay, and anybody
bring it
else
on.
who wants to
Everyone.
come.
This is a whole team.
They're trying to
effort.
learn how this
It takes a village.
No, this is so great. It's a lot of expertise that we need, and we just appreciate. As you guys remember, we had this one returned back to committee because it needed some more discussion, and we need to flesh some things out. Tiffany, why don't you start us off? Tell us your thoughts since.
Yes, yeah,
She's just
so
gonna laugh.
just to recap. So yes, we're here to seek your direction and approval to seek legislation to amend identification and exit criteria for the state turnaround program. I don't know that we need to walk through all the background. I think you all probably have that in your heads. But yes, we were here with you in November. You forwarded a recommendation to the board to change the identification criteria to be an annual identification of the lowest 5% of all schools using a 3-year average, and exit criteria of the school performing above the lowest 15% of schools. And then the board had discussion about that. Some of the key decision points, I think, as far as our understanding is whether to identify schools annually or once every 3 years, including the impact on resources that decision has. So we have some modeling to share as far as that's concerned, and then also whether to set the exit criteria at 10 or 15%. So we actually really appreciated the time to conduct further modeling, further analysis to continue this conversation. So I'll turn it over to Anne Michelle to share the results of some of that with you.
Okay. Do we have this in this presentation?
No, because we were working into late hours last night, but I'm happy to share it with you after.
Okay.
Is that okay?
We just want to make sure we weren't missing something.
Okay, I'm happy to send it to you afterward. So when we are thinking about state turnaround identification, we really appreciated your thoughts and questions, and like Tiffany said, the opportunity for us to think more deeply about those questions, and we tried to really address the concerns that were brought up both here and in board meeting. Essentially, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, we want to try to create a more coherent system of support. In the state, we have a continuum of supports for schools, and we'll talk about that more in the presentation, but aligning systems is kind of our ask here from this committee, and the purpose of bringing this to the legislature, so that those practices are coherent and targeted and truly impactful for schools. So I'm going to give you an analogy. There are lots of analogies in this presentation, you'll see. So if we think about it from a public health perspective, you're probably familiar with the tiered model of intervention. That initially came from public health. So let's say that there was a natural disaster and a lot of people are sick. And the emergency rooms are filling up with people. There are people in the hallways. There aren't enough doctors and nurses to take care of everybody. People are being treated very briefly, and they're running out of medications and all these kinds of things. Then we learned that the cause of people becoming very sick is because there's something in the water. So the first thing to do is to share a universal message that do not drink the water. It's not safe to drink the water. Here's a place you can go to get clean water. For the second tier of support, they might set up regional triage centers where people who aren't incredibly sick or they're just a little sick, they can go for treatment to these local places. And that reserves the most intensive resources for those who are in the most need. That reserves those emergency room resources for the people who are the most sick. So when we're thinking about
the supports we provide to schools, and especially when we're thinking about state turnaround, we want to think about these schools that are the most in need. In the accountability system, we always refer back to our theory of action, and this comes from the technical manual, that part of the purpose of accountability is to distinguish performance meaningfully so that targeted supports can be provided to students that are most in need. And so that is sort of what's driving much of this, the thought and the work behind the changes we're seeking. So right now we're truly kind of in a bit of a somewhat psychedelic game of chutes and ladders, which is much different than an aligned, coherent system of continuous support. We have schools in different stages of turnaround with different criteria for identification, different criteria for exit, different requirements that they need to meet. So as we're trying to think about alignment and coherence, we thought of what are the levers that we can consider in turnaround that could create better alignment and more coherency in identification. So I'm primarily going to be speaking to the identification process, and then Tiffany, I think, will talk a bit about exit at the end. But the three things that we looked at most closely were the model of identification, the frequency of identification, and the length of time for implementation for meaningful change for schools. So first, like I said, to align the methods or the models for identification. Current state turnaround method is 2 consecutive years in the bottom 3%. The current state plan CSI method of identification is a 3-year average in the bottom 5%. Our analyses show that there's not much difference, but a 3-year average does account for fluctuation, whereas a 2-year consecutive can sometimes miss a school if they have a high year, or it can misidentify a school if they have a low year. Averaging sort of accounts and stabilizes those decisions. The second, and it seems like my sense anyway, and takeaway from the discussions we've had previously, was that this wasn't too big of a concern, that it feels comfortable staying with a 3-year average for identification. So I won't spend too much time talking about this part. What we looked at the most closely, though, was the frequency of identification, because this seemed to be the biggest question from the board. So I would like you to meet the balloon of capacity. The best analogy we could think of for how this whole process works for identification is a balloon. So under the current method for state turnaround identification, if you are annually identifying schools, you're blowing air into the balloon, and then adding more air the next year, and then adding more air the next year. If this is a symbol for the capacity that we have to support schools, that balloon just gets bigger and bigger until it becomes unsustainable, or it might pop. So if we align the method with the identifying schools in the bottom 5% of schools once every 3 years, we are raising the bar from 3% to 5%. So we are capturing more schools, but we are filling that balloon with air, tying a knot at the bottom, attaching a string, and taking it on an adventure. And then that allows time to focus resources, to support, and time for the school to implement meaningful change, rather than stretching resources and capacity beyond what they might otherwise be able to handle. So we did some pretty intensive modeling of the number of schools that would be identified under these two different methods, annual identification versus once every 3 years. We compared the number of schools under both. We modeled both the 3-year average and the consecutive years below threshold approaches in how we would identify them. We modeled schools with and without exiting, and we considered all schools, not just Title I schools. One of these analyses was done here by Aaron and his team, and the other was done, I did it in collaboration with the Center for Assessment. We found, working with the center, we modeled 5 years, Aaron's team modeled 10 years, and our findings were nearly identical. So that was pretty reassuring that we were finding the correct thing. So the design of this was to compare the different approaches. We used data from 2015 to 2019 actual data to project forward for the next 3 years, and then also for the next 10 years. What we found was that identifying annually always identifies more schools than identifying once every 3 years. Therefore, this 3-year identification pool is a proper subset of the annual identification pool, and so our essential question became, how big is that difference? Because that is directly relevant to resources and capacity. So in the bottom 5, in comparing these two models, looking at identifying the bottom 5% every year versus every 3 years, we found that this is looking at a 3-year snapshot, and if we identify every year, we would identify 64 elementary schools and 12 high schools, and that actually captures the bottom 8.5%. It's actually identifying around 8% of schools, not 5% of schools as intended. Whereas the the once every 3 years is actually truly capturing the bottom 5% of schools. And another interesting thing is, I've noted at the bottom, is that if we go into 5 years, we're actually identifying closer to 12% of all schools. And then that just continues to increase if we, under the annual identification model. So modeling the financial impact, again, on a 3-year snapshot, this is based on an annual allocation of $6 million per year over 3 years. So we took a total of $18 million, divided that by the number of schools that would be identified under the annual model. I can go back and you can see there's 76 schools in the every year model and 47 schools in the 3-year model. That's important to note, that difference, supporting 76 schools versus 47 in a 3-year period is quite a large difference. That $18 million spread among 76 schools is a total of almost $237,000, and that's over the entire course of 3 years, which I believe is barely enough to cover the cost of the vendor contract.
It's less than.
It's less than.
So currently in board rule, an amount is specified to go toward the contracts with turnaround experts, and $240,000 over 3 years. That's the base, though. It can go up from there depending on number of students and distance from Salt Lake. So there's that piece, and then another piece just to note real quick is that the $6 million is there's actually $7 million appropriated to the program annually, but subtract for administration, subtract for comprehensive needs assessment, root cause analysis, subtract for the leadership piece, and you get right around $6 million. So just wanted to explain that piece.
So that's what we used in our estimate. If we look at identifying once in every 3 years, only identifies 47 schools, that true bottom 5%, the true lowest performing percent of schools, that $18 million over 3 years goes up to $382,979, so nearly $383,000. So it's a $150,000 additional dollars to go to that school over a 3-year period. And then the third thing we looked at, we are considering proposing as a change to turnaround statute as it is currently, is the length of time schools have to exit. So I'm going to let our school improvement friends talk about this piece.
Well, currently in state turnaround, schools have 3 years to complete the process, whereas in SS school improvement, they have a 4-year process. So in order to converge these two programs or to add coherence, we were proposing to go with the longer term, mostly in regards to what the National Implementation Research Network has to say and other experts in the field research. I believe at last minute I added to your backup where it was essentially a list of some research and points garnered with the help of UEPC, the Education Policy Center helped us gather those. And it's just to note that the type of deep systemic leadership change, the types of changes that need to be made in mindsets and in the cultures of schools to retain and recruit teachers is something that we should respect and honor and notice that it bears out in the research as well. That short-term school improvement efforts don't seem to have the kinds of lasting impacts that those that take more time do. That's not to say that there isn't urgency in this and that we do not wish to see children languish in schools that are low performing. It's to say that to have a comprehensive intervention or response to a disaster, which I don't love that term. I mean, I like the analogy because it helps you think about tiered efforts and things, but that type of the findings that we're finding in school improvement and the importance of making these changes that aren't just a quick change to a widget or a quick change to a process in a factory take time and take the kind of implementation science and learnings that we learned from the research. So.
What kind of data do you have from schools that have gone through the 3-year turnaround plan, and have any of them fallen back into the low performance? Or what can you tell us about what's been happening there?
Yes, in fact, with the cohort 1 schools, there were 26 schools in that first cohort of turnaround, and it was based, that original legislation was just looking at schools that were in the lowest 3% of schools statewide for 1 year. So there were 26 schools. At the end of that 3-year period, some of those schools did exit. The exit criteria was just to move up 1 letter grade in their school grade. So if they had an F, they needed to move up to a D. So what happened with that is I think 47% of those schools actually exited, but the remainder of those schools were immediately either re-identified. One school was exited and then was immediately re-identified for turnaround in the next cohort. Several of the other schools that happened to also be Title I schools exited turnaround and were immediately identified for comprehensive support and improvement under the Every Student Succeeds Act. So what we found is, though those schools were working really hard, there wasn't enough time for them to really implement deeply, as Leslie was talking about, the implementation science research that we know exists in the social sciences. Says for social sciences groups like education, health reform, those kind of sectors of our world, takes a longer time to really turn things around and make things that are sustainable. We also have some things that we'd like to build into maybe some case studies at one point in time of schools that were in improvement a number of years ago prior to the turnaround law, that were in improvement under No Child Left Behind, and then the Esea flexibility waiver. So we have examples. For example, Edison Elementary in Salt Lake City a number of years ago was almost the very rock bottom elementary school in the state, at least within Title I. They got a 3-year competitive federal grant, but they also had some time to plan. So they exited that status at the end of 3 years, but that school has continued to focus on continuous improvement. They have 99% free and reduced lunch poverty rate in that building. Very high percentages of students who are English learners, but they are continuing to focus on improvement. And since that original principal was there for those first 3 years, they've had at least 3 other principals. That school has never been re-identified for any category of improvement, not even targeted support and improvement. Lincoln Elementary in Ogden did a wonderful turnaround. They went from being an improvement to becoming a national distinguished Title I school. Lincoln Elementary in Granite District was in cohort 1 of turnaround. They exited and again have not gone back into any sort of improvement because they put in place kinds of things that were then became sustainable. So even as a principal may have moved on into a district position or maybe retired or moved to another district, the things that they put in place became systemic in a way that just became, this is how we do school in this building. And so as new administrators came on, as new teachers entered it, they were brought into that culture of continuous improvement, and we have schools, Spring Creek Elementary in Provo District is another one that went from improvement to becoming a national distinguished Title I school. They have around 87% poverty, and again, a high percentage of students who are learning English. They continue to be at the top of the rank orders for Title I schools in the state. And there are many other examples that I could give you. Those are just some right, off the top of my head. But because they put sustainable things in and had enough time to really get those solid before some new initiative came along or something else was knocking at their door, we've seen those schools continue to improve, to stay out of any sort of improvement. Teachers that were very discouraged at the beginning and thinking, oh, wow, this is so hard. Why have we had this designation? I'm not sure I want to stay here. Just become these amazing advocates for the continuous improvement process. It's just been amazing to watch some of those transformations occur. And then to talk to teachers at the beginning and then talk to them later on. And parents, we've done focus groups with parents and with students. And they will just tell you how those changes started occurring over time. And as we go into schools, each year just to kind of see how it was going, it was visible, it was palpable, you could feel it. I remember going into Lincoln Elementary in Granite a few years ago. Max was on that visit as well. And we were doing a focus group with children. And one of the boys that was in that focus group said to us, you know what? And this was in year 2. So they'd been in 1 year. We went back, this was year 2. And this young boy said, this is not the same school as it was that I went to last year. So we probed, can you explain more? He said, this school is different. And he started listing all the things that were different about that school, how it felt different. It was more inclusive. The teachers were really engaging. The instruction was engaging, and how he felt so excited to be there and empowered to be there. The same thing we saw happening with teachers, oh yeah, we were really down in the dumps and, hating this whole thing, and now things are turning around. We're so excited. We see kids doing wonderful things, parents coming in saying, they didn't feel comfortable coming to the schools before. They felt isolated. They weren't sure what to do, and then they were brought in and provided opportunities to really meaningfully engage in their children's education, and parents were empowered. Parents were going to the principals and saying, we really see a need for this thing to occur. And schools are saying, oh yeah, that is something that we need to address. Like the parking lot situation is a total disaster. It's not safe. Parents said, we can help fix that. We have ideas. I mean, It's so remarkable. It just brings tears to your eyes to see some of this occur and how it sustains and builds and becomes a sustainable system in those particular
So do you think that going
schools.
from 3 years to 4 years will be sufficient to make that sustainable?
National implementation research numbers suggest a 5 to 7 years.
Yeah.
But I think it's important, and we talked a lot about Edison Elementary, that the first principal who did the really hard work of starting the turnaround process in that school really got the culture ready, all of the, many of the types of situational, systemic processes in order, so that actual academic,
regular review of
instructional
data. She started working on regular
so they
data
continue
team
to
meetings,
improve.
But then they've had 3 or 4 other principals since that principal left.
So there's no magic number, but I think it also, you need to think of this from an LEA perspective, that a school may only be identified once per year and then have their whole cycle. But if you're in a district, like one of our bigger districts, that may have multiple schools identified, if this is happening yearly and for multiple categories, it can make the focus dissolve a bit on who is in triage or who is in that most in need of support. And the LEA support is coming out as one of the main factors in school improvement work.
Board Member Hanson has a question for you.
Yeah, so I understand that the duration is important, and maybe 2 or 3 years is probably not enough. I mean, I understand that we can't overload resources. I'm wondering though about the method we use to get a certain number of schools in the pipeline. So is there an advantage to having a cohort of schools that are moving together in starting at the same time and trying to finish at the same time? Is that, seems to me that you'd be using the same resources for the same tasks at the same times if you're moving a bunch of schools through in the same cohort, I guess.
Our focus group seemed to say that they felt the support of a cohort was important to their professional growth. The leaders certainly seem to say
the
that.
opportunity to network and share ideas, and we're struggling with this, and another school might say, oh, we have that same issue, and this is something that we tried that made a difference. And so they do feel they have that support. Just like going through a graduate program, if you're in something where you're kind of in a cohort with people you know, and you kind of rely on one another.
Is
And
it
it's
really
like
that much interaction though between these schools? I mean, you've got a separate turnaround specialist in each one. They're all, the ones I've seen have different action plans. They're working on different things.
They attend the leadership and inquiry, or the leadership component together as a cohort, and there seemed to have been some disruption along the way. When you add another cohort and one group is already so far along in their action planning, now there's some they can inform each other. You could probably make a rational argument for both sides, but when we convene, or when the team convenes schools identified for the same category, it seems to make a little bit more sense as well. Here's where you're at in the process. You're all in year 2, lessens the confusion. And that's, any grief cycle or change cycle is going to first start out with a lot of that. So please just make this clear and the expectations obvious. And so that would help the team, I believe, to
well, and then they're not in it alone either. It's like I'm just not one person with this huge task on my shoulders now, because I know Leslie is there and she's going to help me. Max is there and he's going to help me. And I know Aaron is going to help me, and Tiffany and Michelle are going to help me. So then I feel like I can actually carry this hard task, because I'm not in this as a lone principal or a lone teacher or just this isolated school in this whole sea of all this other stuff going on. But I have other people that are there that are going through similar things, and we can support one another.
So, actually probably a couple. Sorry. So as far as resources, I understand we can't overload resources, and we talk about USB resources, then we talk about district resources. Sometimes this may be a charter school or something where it's a very small LEA. I'm not sure just setting a number of schools does that. That controls the resources. So if we have 50 schools and 30 of those are in one, it's exaggeration, or in one district, the district would probably get overloaded. Is that right? Do we need to think about trying to spread things out amongst so that we have proper resources. If there's USB resources needed, LEA resources needed, outside resources needed, do we need to try to distribute those out so that we don't overload a district, so to say? If, you know, if one of our urban districts maybe was the one with, that ended up with the biggest impact?
As you were speaking, I was thinking about local resources as well. Not only is there, you know, maybe a social component to support to being in a cohort and moving together, but also the ability for local resources to be aligned and focused in supporting schools as they move through a process instead of being at different places at different times.
I think it could be leveraged as a strength maybe. If I have 8 schools in my LEA identified for this, and you can find commonalities throughout the needs assessment and root cause analysis, then you can bring in experts. I'm speaking of CSI schools that don't require a turnaround expert. You could pool your resources and blend those funds to serve multiple schools, and it might actually, I'm sure you could think of some reasons why it might overload them as well. And at first I thought that when you asked the question, but I think it might actually lead to creative use, blending, kind of learning from each other within an LEA, because then an LEA has all their own expectations as well over
so then the
many of those
resource
principles.
constraints really at USBE that we're, if that's the case, then that's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Is here's the resource constraint.
Yeah.
So then maybe my last question. So if we're identifying every 3 years, I still go back to, that leaves some schools that could be left. If we take your triage example, they're in the waiting room or the emergency room, and we're telling them, wait for 6 years before you get any treatment. And I have a hard time with that. I think that is there not a way that we could identify every year and just adjust our criteria to get the right number so that we don't overload, rather than saying, get in mind, we wouldn't do that in hospitals, use that example. We would say, you bleed out while we take care of these people, and we'd go, you know, on some kind of the nurse would go out and assess people.
Right.
And bring them in.
We actually thought very deeply about this question that you proposed the first time we had this discussion. And sort of to go back to that tiered model of support, from this office and also districts locally have a continuum of supports. So we've just spelled out some examples of universal, targeted, and intensive supports. Again, those intensive supports being things like state turnaround and CSI, those resources should be reserved for the schools most in need. But there are other things in place to support schools that are, you know, hovering around that 5% line or made it out in 1 year. I'm going to show you an example in a moment, but you know, these are just some examples of the programs we have in place. So thinking back to your point about if we move to a once every 3 year identification model, this might be an example school that had 7% in year 1, then to 5, then 4, and then continued at 4, 4, and 5. If in the first identification cycle they had a 3-year average of 5.3, we are proposing an alert process where we would notify schools that this school would then be notified that they had 2 years in consecutively, or their 2-year average is in the bottom 5%. That allows them to initiate a change process on their own and to utilize their own personnel and their own expertise to start making meaningful change. It's also, Erin and I were deciding that it's statistically likely that they would be identified for TSI, which would be a targeted support and an alert to the school that change needed to occur. Again, so in that first cycle of identification, that school would not be identified because it is not a school that has the highest needs. Those alert years would continue. And again, that gives the school 3 years to implement their own meaningful change, to have complete control over their own programs and change and the types of changes they would make before there are requirements imposed on them by things like CSI and turnaround. But if in the next cycle, it's very likely that school would be captured.
I just wanted to ask you, what is the source of TSI funds and CSI funds? Where do they come from?
CSI and TSI are part of our Title I allocation from the U.S. Department of Education. And so we don't have enough funding to support TSI schools. We currently identified comprehensive support and improvement schools last year, and we have 35. We have 18 Title I schools that are in the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools in the state. There's also a category of comprehensive support and improvement for any public high school that graduates 67% or fewer students on a 4-year average, right, Aaron?
It's 3
3-year average. So we have 18 Title I schools in the bottom 5% and 17 high schools. None of those high schools are comprehensive high schools. Many of them are alternative high schools and some charter high schools that are somewhat alternative. So we are providing the money that we have, which is around $3 million, to those 35 CSI schools.
So, by the way, I think this is another important rationale for alignment and coherence between these two programs, because currently, with our current state turnaround identification method, it identifies between like 4 and 6 or 7 schools a year, versus, with the federal school improvement process, it identifies just the lowest 5% overall, so between 18 and then with the high school, it's up to 35. But yet there's only $3 million over here and $7 million over here, so there's just kind of an equity issue there too.
Scott, I had a question, but Aaron, you?
So Aaron Ruff from Data Statistics, and maybe to answer your question, when you say, well, why can't we just identify every single year? What happens is, as we identify every single year, because of movement, because we see schools moving in and out every single year, there's always movement. What happens, and I don't know if you remember that slide where Michelle said it, is the frequency of that identification is going to increase that percentage that we identify. So for example, when we modeled it, I did the 10-year model, we said, well, let's just identify everyone for 10 years, every year on a 3-year average. At the end of that 10-year, we get every school below 15% were identified because they had dipped inside of their school and moved up above it. And so what's happening again is how often you identify, just going back to that balloon example, is you're filling that balloon really, really, really fast. And so, and you're not actually capturing that 5%, you're saying more identified, more schools I'm actually taking that percent cut and I'm increasing it. The first cycle is 5, the second cycle, as Michelle was showing, is now actually getting about 8%. The next cycle now, so as we go on, very rapidly,
So
you pop it up.
You got exit also happening, right? You took that into account.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, but my question is, why not use a different criteria to identify, and instead of the top, the bottom 5, take the bottom 3 or whatever you need to adjust that to in your model to fill our capacity, and then give people help and not make them wait the 5 years.
Again, it has to do with,
why not adjust the model?
it's that exit
criteria
frame too.
Oh,
Because
they'll always build, but they'll start to drop off too, eventually, right?
Yeah.
Tiffany, you want to?
So I think the challenge is that you would be weighing the annual identification against the alignment with our SS state plan approach. And really the strictest piece within that law is that over 3 years, you must identify the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools. So in order for us to have a criteria that aligns, obviously the state is going to be interested in providing these resources beyond just Title I schools. They want all schools. But then, so a criteria that will satisfy both is that lowest 5%. Doing a consecutive annual, we tried that approach, doesn't identify quite enough schools over 3 years. So even if we go to a lowest 5% using a 2 consecutive approach, which we know identifies fewer schools, over 3 years doesn't guarantee that we're identifying the lowest 5% of Title I schools over 3 years. So I feel like we've tried almost every iteration to make it work, besides just going here, and this is where we've landed, but there could be others.
So tell me again the advantages now of trying to bring this into commonality, because it seems like I really have a hard time with that big gap in identification. I think that's too long. It's too slow of a response time.
Mm-hmm.
But just philosophically, and nothing to do with you guys, I just think that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
To have these schools struggling, I think you're going to burn out principals who are trying to do things without help. If our districts would help them on their own, that would be great. We wouldn't have this problem that we have now. So there's something to be said with the identification and getting help to them. So I have that philosophical problem. But is the alignment with the federal program, is the advantage in that great enough to keep us from doing the state program on a more frequent identification?
I think where we as staff land and based on input from the field, yes. So I want to walk through some of that rationale and then you can decide for yourself. It creates a lot of irrationality within the system to have these both running. So some of that has already been brought up where for state turnaround, we in 2018 exited 19 schools and then immediately re-identified several of those, which is not good for morale or anything
that's
in
kind
those
of a
schools.
separate discussion. Our turnaround program has to be effective.
No, that's, well,
Right?
so
them coming back in means we're not doing turnaround. They're not turning all the way around. We're remediating for a little while and then they're falling back in. They haven't turned around. I think that's
a change.
I think that's a separate discussion.
But
As far as effective turnaround, that's different from identifying the people who should get the help.
Oh, yeah.
Darren and then Michelle.
I think it's important to remember that we're talking about a norm reference
Yeah.
system as well. So the bottom 5%, if our turnaround system works, we'll always have a bottom 5%. All that we're saying is we're going to label schools that previously weren't labeled as the bottom 5%.
These
So
are the same schools going back into bottom 5, right? The ones that Tiffany's talking about, didn't exit. That means we didn't.
what we don't know is what percent of proficiency were they at? Are they increasing their
Yeah, if we had a proficiency model, that would be great, but we're not there, right?
And Michelle, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that for this school, based on these 2 years, consecutively in the bottom 5%, it's statistically very likely, if not completely likely, 100% likely they will be identified for a TSI. That initiates a district support process where the school has to create a plan. The district has to provide support to that school and allows the district to have the opportunity to provide intervention for that school right away. So just because they're not identified for state turnaround doesn't mean that there isn't a program that is going to take action immediately.
Or that we're not aware that they need some help or they're not on alert.
But as I understand it, we're talking different pots of money. So state turnaround is, if you're identified in that lowest 5%, you get state turnaround money from Utah. If you're identified for TSI or CSI, you're getting federal funds to help you. Unless you're not designated Title I, then what do we do? So my understanding, it's an important question for me. I understand that Granite District is not able to designate all of their potentially eligible Title I schools because there are too many of them. So that becomes a salient question.
Yeah, so I think that's back to the point of for the state's identification criteria, wanting to use the all schools as opposed to this Title I designation that the federal school improvement criteria hinges on. And like you mentioned, like right now, the identification criteria for state is 3%, and for federal is 5%. So your question of what happens if there's a non-Title I school between the 3 and the 5%, they're not identified. They're not getting those supports right now. This criteria would change that.
Handle 10 instead of a percentage. I'm sorry, maybe I can ask everybody. So if we have a certain capacity that we can handle, couldn't we just identify the bottom 10, the bottom 20, or whatever we can handle and work with them? Outside the federal programs, I understand we've got that going on. But is that, could we, I mean, those are the ones who are bleeding the worst, right? The bottom, if we took, these are the worst performing state schools in the state, identify them and try to turn them around?
So I think using the lowest 5% on average over 3 years is a predictable, consistent criteria. So it's always going to be 5% of all schools. So whatever that is, 5%. So 47.
Well, it's 5%. Yeah, it's 5% of those schools, but then it depends on whether they exit or not. And we filled it building up, right? Depending on how we break it out. I just wonder if instead of the bottom 5%, if there was an absolute bottom 10, if they were in that average for 3 years consecutive or something like that, we could control the number of schools.
Right.
But that's the purpose of having the alignment. And as a school, I think simplicity matters because turnaround's already scary and confusion is high. And I think anytime we can align and make things simpler is better. For me.
What's the absolute benefit? I mean, to the person on the ground in the school.
To the
A single
student.
school doesn't care whether we're aligned or not. It's only here, right?
No.
So a single school, it does make a difference to them.
Yes.
Are they getting help under 2 different programs?
Sometimes.
And that's what we want to avoid. So I'll let
Just my friend, who works as a second grade teacher in an elementary school, and as I entered this position, I just said, what did you think about some of the support you got? And come to find out, they were both a SIGA, School Improvement Grant recipient, and then also had been identified for turnaround. And though she was the chair of the improvement department, is the rep for the local, very, very involved, seemed to have flaws in her understanding of the 2 different types. And whether they were really super important flaws, it seemed to me they were, because I was asking questions about just like quality of services that you received through, and she was mixing them all together, the more I learned. So I think even those who are very astute, the day-to-day life of a teacher is very complex.
Sure.
And so that was an on-the-ground example for me, excuse me, of that and what incoherence we've kind of created inadvertently.
Yeah, and then the fact that it changes every year.
And then TSI, I sent out that letter yesterday, and the confusion that it has created as well, despite how clearly we think we're presenting this information, is a really good formative assessment of the understanding that's going on. And I'm seeing, my top student is not understanding this.
And
It's an issue.
TSI, any public school in the state can be identified as a targeted support and improvement because it's based on individual student groups, such as students who are learning English, students who are economically disadvantaged, students who are from a major racial ethnic group. So those individual student groups can identify a school for targeted support and improvement long before they would rise to the surface as being a turnaround school or a CSI
So
school.
could a school be getting TSI, CSI, and state turnaround? They can't do all those?
Technically, they can be identified for those things, but they're only beholden to the processes of the one. Essentially, turnaround out,
Yeah, turnaround trumps CSI.
CSI and TSI. And then TSI then becomes points of data along the way. So if you're already a CSI school, you have a plan in place and you were just identified for having a low student group EL, then you really need to implement. And then there are consequences if you don't have effective programs for TSI. So it's not that they're just getting a a quick identification with no consequence along that way.
And if I can just add, so your TSI identification happens every year. That is an annual identification. Every school and every student group within that school is evaluated based upon that 5% criteria, and that's just because that's where we marked it. So every year you say, if I'm a turnaround school, I can also quickly say, look at the data we give out in the spreadsheets, and these are the student groups that you should really be looking at, because you can say how high or close to that cut. And so you have that every single year that it's going out to them.
So if we're already identified as a turnaround school, and then TSI criteria says that targeted groups need, they don't get additional.
There's no
on top of that,
there's no
right?
additional funding because you're already at that that trauma
So they're
period.
working under one program at
Yes.
a time, even though they may be identified under.
But you can still see, and here's all the other things that are coming as an alert. It's the same thing right now where on turnaround. If I'm a Title I school too, and it just depends on the identification, you're also CSI because you're down the bottom 5.
Yeah.
Just because you're in the bottom 3, the criteria to select you is slightly different. Again, that's the recommendation. You line these things up so it's all, you don't have confusion of which one you are. You are in the bottom 5. You've identified it, and here are now all the other alerts, the tier 2, tier 3 levels, saying, okay, this is what we can do for you. Start paying attention to these groups. Are they slipping? Are they moving? And they can start tracking all of these student groups, overall scores and such, in the rank order. And again, we give them, every year, we do give them all that data. This is where we're at. So they won't walk into this blind.
No, I understand they won't walk in line. I'm just talking about the assistance that they can get the waiting period. Maybe it would help, the letter that we sent out, how many schools were identified for TSI in this year's qualifying group? Anybody know?
Brand new or total?
Brand new.
I think brand new was like 75, wasn't it?
TSI or?
75 new.
75 new?
Seems something around that. Last year there were 330 TSI schools, and this year I think you identified an additional 75, Aaron. Something around there. Yes, additional
Who hadn't been
75
identified before.
schools, yeah. We're not talking student groups, because there's lots of student groups identified, but schools. And then there were also, when Aaron, he did the data from last year and then to this year, there were 16 schools that were identified for TSI last year had actually made progress. So if they make progress again next year, then essentially they can exit TSI status. So Aaron's constantly giving him those, here you are now, next year, here you are, you didn't make any progress, or you did make progress this year.
And that, the TSI identification it began last year.
Yeah.
It's a new part of this system of support or intervention, identification and warning that schools have. It's just been introduced into our overall turnaround program. So it's relatively new, but that points to that there's a notification. Those eventually will go up on the school report card, so the community will become aware. February, those will be posted on the report card, and community members will be able to see if their school, their neighborhood school has a TSI school, which puts increased emphasis on the local school principal, community council, and district to make sure they're identifying and addressing the issues related to that student group that's underperforming in their community, which should, again, lend to increased support for the schools, although for Member Hanson, we recognize it doesn't send the money associated with turnaround to them. But it hopefully points to that they're not being ignored, at least at their local level.
Just looking at time and thinking about that, I'm wondering if we can maybe kind of make a decision on how we feel about the entry criteria. But do committee members have more questions on entrance or turnaround before we try to make that decision? Is that okay with you, Tiffany, with that?
Oh, yeah.
To do that first before we move to exit? Committee members?
Well, I have the same concerns that Scott has about the time lapse for identification for students who are languishing in these schools.
I'm open to your suggestion.
Is there another way to?
This a little bit ahead of time.
To-
So we could have looked at it before
Yeah,
coming in
well,
sort of
I went back and
right
reviewed
now.
what we had in November, and at that time, I was understanding it was an annual identification, and so I was feeling pretty good, and then I read this, and I thought, oh, this is different. So.
And I guess my concern is, when you try to do a lot, you end up doing nothing. I mean, I just see that as a teacher, and I don't want that balloon to pop, and I would rather target those bottom 5% that really need it, knowing that the others are gonna have help, they're gonna have other means of help, and they're gonna be on alert. And schools can do things. Schools know that too, they're very aware. And I just wanna do good things with what we have instead of trying to stretch ourselves thin. So that would be my preference, to stick with the three-year average every 3 years. But I don't know, Mark, how are you feeling about, what are your thoughts?
I've been on the side of Scott most of the time, because it's just like you want to get somebody some help. There's a reason usually that a school's having problems, whether it's a culture in the building, whether it's an administrator, whether it's funding, whether it's whatever it is. And unless it's brought to someone's attention as quickly as possible and change are starting to be made as quickly as possible. The example that Scott and I talked about before is a student could enter in kindergarten, miss that first cycle so they could go to school for 2 years, and then be put on the turnaround and given another 3 years. By the time they hit 5th grade, they're gone. They've wasted their entire elementary career in a school that's not performing as well as they could. Same reason as keeping a teacher that maybe isn't doing as well as they could and doesn't want to remediate. There's no sense in stuffing kids in that class that are not going to have that ability to be pushed and to reach their full potential. But then at the same time, I start to see your cyclical examples that you're giving me, that it's just like a democratic society. It's a slow process. It doesn't change overnight, and it takes a little while. Having had some experience with a school that wasn't a turnaround school, but changed its culture and is immediately starting to see a climb, it was a change of personnel that did it. It makes a difference to me to see that as long as they're starting to get that help, as long as they're starting to be recognized that they need the help, I'm good with that 3-year period. But if they're just going to sit until recognized and then we'll throw them in there and do it, I still struggle with that, I guess.
Well, and speaking on behalf of schools, I have to say no school just sits. I mean, I've been in a school 25 years, and we look at the data every year, whether you're on turnaround or not. And you get in your PLCs in your departments, you're constantly revising, you're constantly looking at ways to improve. It's not that you're just sitting. And I think we forget that schools are their own communities. They are looking for ways to improve, whether they're here or here or here. And so there's some trust we have to do. It's like the tier 1, the tier 2 intervention. This is for those that are severely needing the help. We need to remember that doesn't mean others aren't getting the help they need and others aren't doing natural ways to improve. Teacher, and then Darren, will you add?
Yeah, so the other thing we should remember is last year the Teacher Student Success Act was passed, and a significant amount of funding now is available to every LEA. And the purpose of that funding is to improve student outcomes. You have to have a district framework. That didn't exist when the school turnaround system was established. So when we talk about limited resources, that's true. I don't think anybody in Utah's education system would say we have extra resources, but there are funding sources available to LEAs to address the very issues we're talking about today outside of the state turnaround, which is again designed for the most significantly challenged school communities.
And I know this is timely. Staff needs to know what to seek during for legislative changes, and just for time's sake, I'm going to make a motion, and it may not pass because I think I might be on the minority side, but I'm going to do it anyway just to see. I'm going to move that for turnaround, we seek the lowest, 5% using a 3-year average for entrance. Any discussion of that motion?
Identified how often?
Every 3 years.
See, that, I agree with the first part.
I know, but I don't want that balloon to pop. So that's what I'm saying. I'm just throwing it out there just to see where we are. And I think we've had the discussion, so I'll just ask. Superintendent Dixon?
Yeah, I just, we've had the opportunity to go out and visit turnaround schools, and I just want to give kudos to our team who do an amazing job. But it's been really interesting to have deep conversations with them about what has worked and what hasn't. And one of the things that popped out at me is the 3-year time span is sort of, not to coin the phrase turnaround, but if you really follow the trajectory of how long it takes for them to really make significant changes, that's about the time frame. Because one is that first year is really deep dive into the data assessment. Second is getting it in place, and third year is really that implementation. And I personally have imposed things on schools where I'll say, hey, have you tried this? We're like, this year we're focused on culture, or this year we're focused on behavior, because they've got this systematic way of getting to better outcomes. I just checked in with Superintendent Dave Long from Beaver just a few hours ago when I was over at Little America with their meeting to ask about Milford Elementary. They're an elementary that, and I think this is the right number, I think I called them Minersville earlier, but it's really Milford. And they were like at 14% and went to 49% in a couple of years. They had intensive literacy instruction with coaches in their building all the time for a solid year. And then the next year to implement. So first year plan, second year professional learning, third year. But even during that year of professional learning, they made that huge leap of about 30 percentile. So just keep that frame in mind. I know identification is important, but as they're in discovery and leadership changes are made in schools, there's really this time frame of a couple of years to get everything in place. So one of the complaints that we heard, and Leslie and Matt, you can back me up with accuracy, is when they flip from one system into another. So let's say they're in turnaround, they step right into TSI, or like they talked about this constant churn of support and help and identification and the need for some time and consistency. Did I capture that correctly?
I think you're speaking of the principal,
Yeah,
one principal
yeah.
who went from turnaround, felt elated that they had exited, and then immediately was put into CSI and was more demoralizing than any other. And she was frank with us that it made her want to leave the profession, and that they felt, burdened. And she's leading the charge, and I think that mindset will start to change, but I think we want to avoid losing our most transformational leaders to that kind of not nonsensical, somewhat, process.
And just really giving them the time and the support that they need to keep doing what they're doing. And I think our district leaders and certainly our state leaders are leaning in a little more proactively when they see something's not working. And I'm already seeing leadership changes being made. Those kinds of things are occurring to jumpstart processes. So back to your earlier point about sitting, I think we're just in a different space than we were a couple of years ago.
Any other discussion? I know we have a motion on the table.
I just want to give a shout out because I read about this in the newspaper. Midvale Elementary, who came before us and they could not exit turnaround and they begged for more time. We gave them more time, and they were quoting their testing results and how they had improved 1 or 2 steps, and it is a school that has like 100% poverty, and it has lots of kids in and out, and I just thought for them to do that, I was absolutely thrilled.
And that wasn't until because they didn't exit, so they
They
came
didn't
back,
exit.
so it took them significant time to realize.
They did. And they did it.
Yeah.
Let me just ask this, maybe this would appease some of the concerns that we all have. So what if statutorily we do suggest the 3-year identification, but at the state level or at our level, we have our own version of TSI, where we alert schools at risk so that we aren't just leaving them in the lurch, and then we can require a plan with the LEA, for example. So then that at least there's some accountability there.
I would call that prevention.
Yeah, to me that's what I want.
Targeted
I don't want
prevention.
to be a punishment. I want it to be a resource, a help, an intervention, prevention. But I'm trying to get the feel of my fellow committee members here.
I just think we need a little bit more time to work this out. I would I'll vote no today on this, just because I have that concern about the time span. And I think that if we put our minds to work saying, how can we identify most quickly to get the help in while managing the resources, we could remodel and figure out a way to do this. And we've got some really smart heads in here, if that's a priority. For me, it is, and I don't know that it is for everybody, and there's different points of view, but I wish we would have had this a little bit ahead of time so that we maybe could have picked each other's brains before the meeting, but that's kind of where I sit right now. So.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think, what's compelling is always, utilizing the resources as we can. But I'm thinking from the point of view of students, that it just sort of chills me to think of a student languishing in a school without help, for waiting for that 3-year identification period.
Okay, well, since the motion's on the table, let's go ahead and let me just remind you what the motion is to every 3 years identify the lowest 5% of schools using the 3-year average. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
Motion doesn't pass. Well, do we have an alternate motion to offer? Because this is time sensitive. We do need to direct staff to seek statutory change for this to occur.
I know. First division can work out today. I know what that does.
Aaron?
So here's a question. Do you have time, and this is just an alternative, that you could come together, this example, I worked through our model, and Michelle worked through our model. It took us a number of hours to really get our heads wrapped around what is going on here on different identifications. When I say, and to just say, here's the presentation, now make a decision, it's tough. Would it be beneficial if we said, can you come back, and I don't want to impose a time frame on it, you come back and let's spend a number of hours, whatever, saying, let's look at the model and say, this is what you're proposing, now let's roll that out. What happens? Okay, let's do this, what happens? We can start dropping schools in there, and you say, well, I'm worried about this school, I think they'll languish. Okay, let's throw that through, and you see, okay, where does that play out?
Aaron, are you suggesting that they have another standards and assessment meeting, committee meeting? Is that what
Or come study it and then have another one, or?
I don't know how that would play in for the next board meeting.
All of us fairly regularly come for meetings on various subjects to look at it. This one just, I guess Janet and I were both surprised that this came up in this fashion today, because we haven't seen anything, and there wasn't anything posted on Civic Clerk to know heads up kind of what was going on. So we really didn't have a chance, other than your explanation, looking at this on the board today, to think through this. And I know I know everyone here are thoughtful people. I'm not thinking that anyone's trying to do anything. We just, at least speaking for myself, the mindset I came in with and still have is that for a child to go through his whole elementary school career, 5 years potentially in a school that is lowest 5% without being identified and having that targeted help and money, that doesn't sit right with me. I think there's something we can do to get the help to them quicker. And this doesn't meet that criteria, and that's kind of the criteria that I came in with. So I don't know what we can do from here. I'd be happy to sit down if we can find a time to try and talk through it, but I don't know procedurally how we.
Right, procedurally, Jeff, you help us out with that, or?
Well, procedurally, if you don't move forward, then it's just, it's failed. So you'd have staff could bring something up next month. I'm just curious if this would appease any concern, building off of what Board Member Braddock mentioned about some type of alert system built in, maybe also a requirement with that alert that if you're placed on this state TSI, that you're doing a 3-year identification, you're not getting identified for full turnaround, but you're getting state TSI, and you're required to do some kind of local level plan. Put that in statute. And it wouldn't necessarily be a plan that we would check here, but something that the district could come up with and start moving that school forward on improving so it never actually gets identified. And if that would appease the concern, at all?
Possibly, but do we piece all that together right now in the 10 minutes that we have to? They know, the districts know that these schools are low-performing schools. They already know that. And they're not getting help. I mean, we're seeing that. We're seeing schools being in that low 5% for a long time.
Yeah, for one clarifying point to districts know, I think the difference we're finding is that small LEAs and especially charter schools don't seem to have the staff available to analyze data and might have more turnover, and therefore we are surprising some. Yes, big districts, not surprised. In fact, they know before we even call them because they've run the calculations, they know.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a high prevalence, and I could run that to factually give you numbers, but a high prevalence of small LEAs and charter schools that are being identified for some of these and not making progress. So some sort of alert system or training for data analysis or some sort of support that we could provide them to actually understand the data and use their local assets and expertise and the passion that's at those schools to drive change would be beneficial, I think.
Is it possible, would committee members be willing to can we have another standards and assessment meeting in the next couple of weeks? I don't know if that's a possibility. When do we need to let you know this, Tiffany?
Oh.
You're like tomorrow. Yesterday.
No, I mean, I guess, so we would just need some preparation time to continue to think through if there's any magic solution to make this work for everyone. I think there's trade-offs, and there's just inherent trade-offs.
So, but if we don't, so say we don't get something done, the money still flows, we just go under the current system, right, that we've been living with for.
So the urgency as far as this session is for cohort 2 of turnaround that will be coming up for exit in the fall, and so we could address just this narrow issue this year, but it means running turnaround legislation again next year. So there's that. But for cohort 2, the issue is that in state law, the approach at the time that we thought might work was to conduct a statistical analysis to determine whether a school would exit. And this was to control for changes in accountability systems and assessments. We've since learned that that's not feasible or workable. So the language in statute right now, it doesn't really work. What's in rule and what we've communicated to those schools should be held to for those schools, but we would need to codify that for cohort 2. So that narrow issue could be addressed. I think the risk if you don't address that this session is that then those schools come up, and if one of the schools doesn't exit, they'll be like, well, I want the statistical analysis, and then.
Can we do that? Can we just put that patch in place right now? So that this is a valuable discussion. I just don't think we're all there where we need to be to push it forward. Can we do that?
Yep.
Can we pass, do we need to do anything here to authorize staff to address
I think
that
you
issue?
need to make that motion, right? No?
I mean, it is pretty technical and cleanup-y, and the fact that that the board has authorized staff to seek legislation on turnaround. This session, it's up to you, but it might be the cleanest and most transparent to go ahead and make the motion here.
Yeah.
You have to tell us which code section needs to be done. And
Yeah.
How to authorize you to do that, but let's get that done. I think is that.
Yeah, I think we need to make.
I think you could make it really simple by just directing staff to draft language to deal with exit. Yeah, exit language for cohort 2.
Okay, I'll make that motion that we direct staff to pursue legislation to address the problems with exit criteria for cohort 2.
Okay, so the motion before the committee is to direct staff to propose legislation for exit criteria for cohort 2. Okay, any discussion of that motion?
Oh, there's one thing. There is the challenge of, so then exit criteria for at least cohort 4, which you just notified, who you just notified. The exit criteria that's in rule and statute is really not ideal. You know, the fact that what's in rule is get out of the lowest 3% for 2 consecutive years, meaning that by year 2, if you're not out, you already know you're not out, but you're like in purgatory. So, but so then if you have to wait a whole nother session or year to tell those schools what their exit criteria is. That's not ideal. So that's a bit of a wrench. You could change what's in rule, but you still have the conflict with statute.
So codify 2 and exit criteria for 2 and 4.
And 3. And
3.
But, because I'm trying to, with 3, it's a little bit more gray because I think we've already communicated something with them.
So if we get the right exit criteria in statute, we can change the rule, right? You can bring the rule around.
You could, because I think there's more agreement on exit criteria.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we could vote on the exit criteria.
Yes. I think we just address exit criteria.
Originally, I didn't like the 15%, but then after reading some stuff, it helps if they have the 4 years, if they have this and that, then we're gonna keep them out of exit, or out of turnaround.
Yes.
Would that help if we directed you a certain exit criteria?
Yes,
made a
but
motion for
leave
that,
identification criteria
and then we can
the way
work
it
on
is for now.
identification.
That would work, right? I think that would work.
Very helpful.
Would that?
Yes.
So we're at the 15%.
Yes.
I know we didn't.
Can we throw that on the board?
Yeah, we didn't get a chance to have you go through that just to make sure.
Well, the only piece to add, is that when we looked back at the modeling that was done, so Vice Chair Cummins asked whether the 15%, getting above the 15% threshold was associated with the threshold for Title I schools or for all schools.
Yeah.
And obviously we know that unfortunately, that for Title I schools, that threshold is going to be lower.
Yeah.
If you're just comparing Title I schools than to all schools. And so it's going to be that much higher of a bar if it's the all schools cut. And the modeling where we reported that it's getting out of the lowest 15%, just looking at data from 15 to 18, almost 50% of schools would exit with the 15% threshold criteria.
Okay.
That was based on a Title I cut. So
15% of all Title I schools?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that was just Title I schools, but in turnaround, we're talking about all schools.
Yeah.
And so essentially, you just need to recognize that, and we haven't been able to remodel that,
Yeah.
but that threshold, it would be less than 50%. We know that. So it would be less than 50% of schools would exit using the 15% threshold.
Of all schools.
Of all schools, yeah.
All schools.
So do we agree that that just gives them extended help to get them past the threshold so they probably won't
So they don't
slide back
really
in,
enter, which
right?
is demoralizing.
So I'm not so afraid of them staying in if they can't.
Right, and we still
It's
have
more support.
We still have the extension criteria piece. So, yeah.
Okay, so does
So I
somebody
just
want to make a
wanted to
motion
clear
for that? I feel like
Use the motion. I mean,
I don't know how to say the word.
I'll make a motion that we do.
Oh, wait, we didn't finish the last little thing that you suggested to
No, we
write.
didn't vote on it.
You didn't vote on it.
We didn't vote on that,
No.
so.
That's
Okay,
to
so
direct
we-
staff to
But
pursue.
I don't know if we can do that.
I don't think we can include all
Well, I don't
that
think
in
we need
this.
to do both, because I
No, okay, so
Yeah.
can you just take it away?
Yeah.
How do you, can you just like
All right,
swallow this?
I withdraw
Okay,
my previous motion.
I'm pretty sure that's official. Is that correct, Karen?
Everybody agrees.
Okay, that's right. We all agree.
Without objection, I'll withdraw.
Oh, I wish you'd be more organized. Just kidding. It's me, it's me. Yeah. Okay, now, thank you for withdrawing, and now we're back to, I believe it was Janet that was going to say something.
Oh, yes. I am going to make a motion that I will turn to Tiffany Perkins.
Wow. Tiffany, you have the power
Okay.
right now. You're going to channel Tiffany's.
that we seek legislation to amend the exit criteria for turnaround to exiting the lowest performing 15% of all schools.
After 4 years?
After 4 years. That's even better.
Did you want to repeat that, Janet?
No.
Just for fun? Okay, then I'll try to repeat it. So
I'm trying to type it.
the motion, did you type that?
I seek legislation to amend exit criteria to the lowest 15% of all schools.
A 4-year, during a 4-year.
After 4
After
years.
4 years.
After 4 years.
Is it an average?
Yeah, is it an
Based,
average?
it is, yeah, that would be part
No,
of it.
no, it's the same, it's.
Oh, you're right, it's in the year of,
In the-
it's in the year of
Okay.
exit, yes.
Okay, so the
That is
motion
right.
before the committee is to seek legislation to amend turnaround exit criteria to exit the lowest 15% of all schools in a 4-year time period. Okay. Cool. Yes.
Can I
Any,
ask a question before we vote?
Wait, just one second.
Quick one.
Any discussion to that motion?
Yes, quick discussion, thank you. So can they exit early? If they get up
Oh,
above that
good question.
criteria in third year, can they exit early? Do we hold them for, or do we just minimize efforts during the last year?
We've talked about that a lot, and I'm trying to remember all of the conversations and the pros and cons to each.
Right.
Help me out.
I can say that what is in the state plan for exiting for CSI is that a school may exit, I know this because I've typed it 100,000. A school may exit CSI status if they are above the 15% after 3 and up to 4 years. So they can exit in the third year if they meet the criteria, but they have a fourth year if needed.
Aaron?
Can I just add to it? If they're getting above the 15% mark within 1 year, our system's broken.
Yeah, you haven't identified.
We're not identifying
Right.
the actually low performing.
Right.
And so that's, just let you know.
One, I don't agree, if after 3, if they've got it, I want.
That's why we're saying 1 year, it's like,
Yeah.
our system is not identifying low performance. It's got too much noise in our fluctuation, and that's what we've done a lot of work to make this thing very
Stable.
sound and stable. So when we identify our 5%, we say, we know with high surety that this is the ones that are critical.
And they're gonna be on a trajectory to try and get out of that. So, okay, does that need to be in at all? I mean, when we say after 4 years,
I
are we
think
gonna
the
wait for the
more-
4 years and we
I
just
think
withdraw health a little
specificity
bit?
is we've learned data.
Third year.
I think either way, but I do think it is an important consideration, so to include it in the motion, if that's important to you, I think would be good.
Do you want to
Exceed
extend
50%.
So
I'm
let me
thinking,
hear
I'm
again. I
thinking
hear
they
what-
get
I
support
hear what
and
you're saying.
help
Yes,
us
If
on what
after
they
1 year
want
they're
to.
done, then we didn't do it right.
No.
But if they really catch hold and after 3 years they get up and 15%
But
is
then
a
they
high
still have the
hurdle,
support though,
then
that fourth year.
I say, maybe it's okay to let them out, you know, if they've done
But being
that.
let out means they get fewer resources and help, so I
So it
think
like tapers off.
to sustain them, they
Just keep them
would,
the 4 years.
they would want to have that
Let's
fourth
leave the
year.
motion
I
as
would
is.
if it was me.
Sorry.
Get allowed.
That's,
out.
it's a good discussion. Okay, so, let's vote on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion carries. You can go ahead now and seek legislation for that thing. And then, Tiffany, is there anything else we need to do with this for now because we can't come to a decision on the entrance?
I guess the question is, with the momentum and everything, like, we'll forget so much by
Yes.
next year, so do we want to just continue the
I
conversation
feel like
on
we need to
identification?
keep the conversation going, and
So bring it
if
back next month.
committee members need to meet with Aaron, for example, and I don't know, I just volunteered you, Aaron.
It's okay.
But I think he
Threw him under the
kind of
bus.
offered, you know, if you want to work through some things or have ideas.
Mhm.
Because you guys have spent hours and hours and,
I know you guys have put in a lot of work.
yeah, and
If-
thank you. I really appreciated the
I would
presentation.
be interested in participating in something where we explored maybe a way to accomplish the thing that's got some of us hung up about that long
And I'll-
lifetime.
I'll come to.
Like, and that might be good, because then maybe you'll find a place that feels good, you know, and also.
Well, we're juggling resources, and then we're juggling getting the help to these kids. And how do we balance that out?
Yep.
You
But
guys
as
are
you
probably
guys-
way ahead of us, but we have a chance to absorb for a
So
second.
you feel okay about it?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much.
And I'll send this presentation to you.
Then I'll
Thank you.
catch it.
And then you
Thanks,
can.
everyone.
Thank you guys for your effort.
Thank you so much.
This has not been easy, but at the same time, it's important and we need to do